There was a night when the empire that had ruled the known world simply dimmed. Not in a single collapse or the crash of swords on marble, but in silence. The lights that once burned across the Roman roads began to flicker out. One by one, the hum of markets faded. The certainty of time, once measured by the empire's unbroken rhythm, dissolved into a fog of unknowing. And in that quiet, a new kind of darkness began, one not of sky, but of memory. Imagine waking in a city that once pulsed with life. The fountains dry, the baths cold, the temples abandoned. Wind moves through empty forums where senators once debated the fate of nations. The smell of smoke lingers, not from war, but from absence, homes burning for warmth, not conquest. The empire that promised eternity had grown old overnight, and its heart had forgotten how to beat. No decree marked its end, no grand farewell, only the slow retreat of order into myth. Across the landscape, people gathered what they could carry. Some fled the cities for the hills, following the pull of instinct more than reason. Others stayed behind, clinging to the ruins like ghosts, unwilling to leave their former lives. Merchants became wanderers, scholars became farmers, and those who had once traded silver coins now bartered with salt and bread. Civilization had fractured, and no one had the map to put it back together. The roads that tied the world together, Roman veins of stone stretching to every horizon, grew over with weeds. Caravans stopped coming. The distant sound of hooves and wheels disappeared from the valleys. In their place came silence, broken only by the calls of birds reclaiming forgotten towers. Libraries that once stored the wisdom of centuries grew damp, their scrolls eaten by mold. The words of philosophers turned to dust, and the men who once recited them now told stories by the fire to keep the night away. Yet even in the emptiness, life adjusted. Humans always do. In the ruins of abandoned villas, people learned to listen to the seasons again. The wind became their calendar, the stars their clock. Fields sprouted where marble once stood. The empire's collapse was not an explosion, but a long exhale, the world breathing differently, uncertain if it was dying or being reborn. For generations, people had lived beneath the weight of greatness. They believed the empire eternal because it had always been. Its fall was unthinkable, like the sun forgetting to rise. But as the legions vanished and governors fled, a question began to echo in the hearts of the survivors. What if this was not the end, but the beginning of something older, something more human? The people who had depended on Rome to feed, clothe, and protect them were suddenly forced to remember skills long buried under comfort. In that remembering, the world began to reshape itself. A man who had once kept accounts for a merchant now learned to till soil. A woman who once embroidered silks now learned to weave wool from her own flock. The empire had fallen, but the art of endurance, ancient, instinctive, rose quietly in its place. They no longer built monuments to emperors. They built fires that kept their children alive through the winter. The shift was not only physical but spiritual. The gods of marble faded, their temples crumbling, yet belief itself did not die. It turned inward, humbler, and closer to the earth. People prayed not for conquest but for warmth, for rain, for one more harvest. The divine was no longer in the Senate's decrees, but in the soil beneath their hands. And in that soil, a new world began to grow, unseen by history's scribes. As the centuries that followed came to call this time dark, they forgot how bright the stars can be when the cities no longer outshine them. Darkness, after all, is a matter of perspective. To those who lived through it, this age was not only loss, it was rediscovery. Freed from the empire's clockwork order, they found the rhythm of survival again. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet earth, the sky vast and uncaring, the night both enemy and teacher. Each dawn was earned. Somewhere in the crumbling provinces, an old soldier wrote that the world had become too quiet, but perhaps it was not quiet at all. Beneath the silence, the forests whispered, rivers sang, and people listened. They began to speak in new tongues, to dream new myths. Knowledge that could not be carried in scrolls was carried instead in stories. Firelight became their classroom. Memory, their library. This was how the old world ended, not with collapse, but with transformation. A civilization forgot itself so that humanity could remember what it meant to survive. The ruins that still stand today are not only monuments to what was lost, they are reminders of the threshold that our ancestors crossed. They walked through the ashes of empire and found themselves again smaller, poorer, but infinitely alive. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear them. The clatter of wooden wheels on uneven roads, the murmur of voices at a village hearth, the distant echo of a church bell ringing through mist. These are the sounds of a world reinventing itself, one day at a time, a fragile dawn rising over the remnants of greatness. And as the smoke from the last Roman fires faded into the pale morning, the survivors stood at the edge of something vast and uncertain. They did not know they were stepping into history's shadowed Middle Age. They only knew that the world had changed and that somehow they must learn to live again. From that darkness, the long art of survival would begin anew, whispered from one generation to the next, waiting for us to remember it. When the empire fell silent, so too did its scholars. The grand libraries that once held the heartbeat of civilization stood empty, their marble halls echoing with the hollow breath of forgotten tongues. Scrolls that once promised immortality turned brittle in the damp air, the ink fading like memories unspoken. History would later tell us that knowledge died here, that the dark ages swallowed light whole. But that is not the truth. The truth is quieter, hidden in places where no historian cared to look. Far from the collapsing cities, in valleys blanketed by fog, the keepers of memory retreated. They were not kings or generals, but men in woolen robes, their days marked by prayer and ink. In candlelit monasteries, they copied what fragments they could find: medical texts, maps, bits of poetry, even the philosophies of those who once called themselves gods. Each word they saved was an act of rebellion against oblivion. To them, the written word was more than knowledge. It was light preserved inside darkness. But not all wisdom survived on parchment. Some lived in footsteps and whispers, carried by those who could not write but would not forget. Wanderers, healers, and storytellers became the secret libraries of a broken world. A herbalist's chant might carry the memory of Roman medicine. A lullaby sung to a child might hide an ancient prayer to a forgotten deity. The great vaults of Rome had fallen, but humanity had found a new way to keep its secrets woven into stories, disguised as faith, buried in rhythm and rhyme. Monks worked in silence, their breath visible in the cold. Their pens scratched endlessly, even when war or plague swept across the land. They knew they were writing for a future they might never see, copying texts they barely understood, saving them for someone who might. The monasteries became islands of light in an ocean of darkness, quiet sanctuaries where the flame of knowledge flickered, fragile yet unyielding. Every stroke of ink was a prayer that the world would remember itself. Outside their walls, another kind of preservation unfolded. Among peasants and travelers, knowledge lived through use, not writing. A farmer's weather lore, a shepherd's star map, a midwife's ritual. These were not seen as science, but survival. They were memories older than empires, carried through blood and breath. When scholars later dismissed these practices as superstition, they missed the truth. This was how civilization endured when paper could not. Even the church, which sought order amid chaos, became both guardian and gatekeeper. While it condemned certain texts as heresy, it quietly preserved others in hidden vaults. The same walls that silenced dissent also sheltered fragments of ancient astronomy, mathematics, and healing. It was a paradox only the medieval world could sustain, light and shadow coexisting beneath the same roof. Centuries would pass before anyone realized how close humanity had come to forgetting itself. Many of the works that shaped the modern world survived not because of grand design, but because of chance and devotion. A monk's decision to copy one extra manuscript, a pilgrim's tale retold beside a fire, a mother's whispered charm to keep illness away. Each act, small and unnoticed, became a thread in the fabric of survival. The knowledge that endured was not always pure. Over time, It changed Roman logic, softened by myth, Greek reason, colored by faith. But in that transformation, something remarkable happened. Wisdom became human again. It no longer belonged to empires or philosophers. It belonged to anyone willing to remember. The secrets of the past were not lost, they adapted, reshaped by those who needed them most. Imagine, for a moment, a monastery deep in the wilderness. Snow drifts against its stone walls. Inside, the flicker of candlelight reveals a single figure bent over parchment. He copies a text about stars written 1,000 years before him, his quill trembling with cold. He doesn't understand the equations, but he knows they matter. Beyond the walls, wolves howl. Inside, a universe survives on ink and faith. Meanwhile, miles away, an old woman in a wooden hut grinds herbs into a paste. She hums an ancient melody that her grandmother taught her, believing it will draw out sickness. Science will later call her ignorant, but in truth, her remedy is the last echo of Roman medicine, passed through generations untouched by parchment. Two worlds, the sacred and the humble, both fighting the same silent war against forgetting. And in this quiet war, no single hero existed. There was no one to thank, no name to remember. Knowledge did not belong to anyone. It hid within everyone. The wisdom that survived the Dark Ages did so because it had already learned how to hide inside faith, song, and superstition. The truth became invisible, not erased, but disguised. We often imagine progress as a straight line, Rome to Renaissance, ignorance to enlightenment. But the path of knowledge is more like a heartbeat, pulsing between rise and fall, life and near death. Each time humanity loses itself, it remembers again through those who refuse to let go. The monks who copied by candlelight, the healers who worked in secret, the travelers who told stories across continents. These were the invisible architects of the world that would come. And while the official histories would later name this era dark, those who lived within it saw light in smaller things, the glint of ink on parchment, the warmth of a story shared beside fire, the pattern of stars that still guided wanderers home. Knowledge was no longer the privilege of empires. It had become a kind of faith, something to be tended rather than owned. When history said it was lost, someone kept it alive, not for glory or reward, but because the act of remembering was itself sacred. The flame of civilization never truly died. It simply moved out of the palaces and into the hearts of those who refused to forget. And so, beneath the weight of time, humanity endured. The monasteries became the quiet lungs of Europe, breathing knowledge into centuries that had forgotten how to speak its language. And beyond their walls, ordinary people carried that same breath in stories and rituals that outlasted kingdoms. The light that had once illuminated Rome now flickered softly in thousands of unseen places, waiting for the world to look their way again. It is here, in this hidden exchange between silence and survival, that the true story begins, the story of how medieval people would take the remnants of a fallen empire and shape them into a new way of living. They did not rebuild Rome. They built something far more enduring, the art of survival itself. The world after empire was a quieter one. Without the constant roar of armies or the hum of trade, life shrank to the size of a village, and survival became a daily art. In the wide silence of the countryside, people learned again what their ancestors once knew, that warmth, safety, and food did not come from wealth or power, but from the patient conversation between human hands and the earth itself. A peasant's home began with mud, straw, and faith. There was no architect, no blueprint. Walls were raised through instinct, hands packing clay into timber frames, children pressing straw into gaps to keep the wind from finding its way inside. When it dried, the house smelled faintly of rain and smoke, as if nature itself had agreed to shelter them. The thatched roof, golden in summer, turned grey through winter storms but never failed. Each beam, each handful of earth, was a promise to endure another season. Inside, the air was thick with the perfume of survival. Smoke curled from the hearth, staining the rafters black, while herbs hung from the ceiling, drying slowly beside salted meat. The The single fire in the center of the room was both heart and guardian. It cooked, healed, and comforted. Families built their lives around its light, careful never to let it die, for rekindling it from cold was no simple task. In some places, neighbors would carry fire from house to house, a quiet symbol of connection, proof that even in isolation, warmth was shared. Nights were long, and the cold unforgiving. The walls did little to stop it, so people learned to build heat, not walls. The floors were packed with straw or rushes, replaced when they began to rot. Bedding was made from wool and linen stuffed with feathers, sometimes damp from the breath of winter itself. Families slept close not out of sentiment, but necessity. Parents, children, even animals huddled together, each heartbeat a part of the same fragile fire. It wasn't luxury. It was the oldest kind of wisdom, the knowledge that warmth is something made together. Outside, survival required rhythm. Every action was guided by season and sky. At dawn, the first smoke rose from chimneys like prayers, and fields woke beneath frost. Tools were few, but they were loved like kin. A single plough might be shared among several families, each taking turns as the soil allowed. The wooden handles were worn smooth from generations of use, and each mark on their surface told a story of survival written not in ink, but sweat. The year itself was divided not by months, but by tasks. Spring meant planting, summer was for tending, autumn for gathering, and winter for endurance. Food preservation was a sacred science, passed through whispers and repetition. Salt was precious, so was time. Meat was smoked in low huts that smelled of oak and ash. Grains were stored in clay jars sealed with wax. Vegetables were buried beneath cool soil to trick them into sleeping until the next harvest. Nothing was wasted. Even bones had purpose, ground into tools, carved into buttons, burned to enrich the fields. When storms came, the people listened. They read the wind as their ancestors had read scripture. A shift in the clouds, the smell of rain, the silence of birds, all were signs, each carrying instruction. Theirs was a world where survival depended on awareness, not control. They did not fight the land, they conversed with it. And through that quiet conversation, they found something the modern world has nearly forgotten: the rhythm of belonging. Water came from wells or streams, often shared by the entire village. There was no privacy, no pretense. Life unfolded in public view, and each person's survival depended on another's labor. The blacksmith's hammer was as vital as the baker's fire. The carpenter's saw, the weaver's loom, every craft connected. Even in the simplest gestures, a hidden complexity thrived. The peasant's life was not primitive. It was precise, every choice weighed by consequence. Inside the home, daily tasks blurred into ritual. The grinding of grain became meditation. The spinning of thread, an act of patience. Mothers taught daughters the secret of baking bread that would last the week. Fathers showed sons how to read the sky before planting. Nothing was written, yet everything was remembered. It was an education older than books, one learned through repetition, error, and endurance. At night, when work was done, the village exhaled. The sound of laughter carried through open doors. A candle flickered in every window, each flame marking a small victory against the vast darkness outside. Stories were told, not to entertain, but to remember, to keep alive the thin thread of identity that stretched from past to present. Tales of saints, of beasts, of forgotten kings, they filled the air with a strange kind of hope, reminding everyone that they were part of something longer than their own lifetime. In this world, comfort was rare but deeply felt. A loaf of fresh bread, a new calf born healthy, a winter that passed without sickness, these were miracles worth celebrating. To modern eyes, their lives might seem bleak, but to them, life was rich with texture and meaning. Every dawn brought proof that they had survived another night. Every harvest confirmed that the earth still answered their call. Even the simplest tool or gesture held purpose. The way they placed a stone in a hearth, the way they turned a loaf to bake evenly, the way they arranged their tools before rest, each movement a quiet conversation with time itself. It was a life built not on convenience, but on awareness. To live without forgetting anything essential was, in its own way, a kind of genius. They built warmth not from wealth, but from wisdom, forgotten by time. Their homes were humble, but they stood through centuries of wind and frost. Their fires burned small, but steady. Their days were hard, yet full. And though history would call them poor, they possessed something rare, the ability to live in balance with the fragile edge between life and loss. In their simplicity, they left us an unspoken lesson, that survival is not merely endurance, but harmony. To be alive was to be in rhythm with the earth's slow heartbeat. They did not seek to master the world, they sought only to belong within it. And in that belonging, they found a kind of peace the modern mind can scarcely imagine. As the night deepens over the thatched roofs and the fires dim to embers, one can almost hear the whispers of those who lived by instinct rather than invention. Their world was small, but their understanding immense. They lived not apart from nature, but within its breathing. And from that quiet life, a truth emerges, one that leads us toward the next part of their story, when survival became something shared, not one family's burden, but a village's heartbeat. In the world that rose from ruin, no one survived alone. The land was too vast, the winters too long, and the night too deep for solitude. A single family could build a fire, but it took a village to keep it burning. Survival was not a skill, it was a covenant. Every breath, every harvest, every birth was bound by invisible threads of trust, woven through generations. Without kings or treasuries, people created their own systems of value. Barter became both economy and language. A basket of grain could become a pair of shoes. A wheel of cheese could pay for a roof repair. A promise was currency, and reputation its measure. To cheat one's neighbor was to starve oneself. For in a world without law, honesty was survival. It wasn't virtue, it was necessity. The man who broke trust was exiled not by decree, but by silence. His fire would find no kindling from others. His harvest would spoil alone. In the heart of every village stood a rhythm older than money. The fields were not divided by greed but by need, parceled out so that all could live through the winter. When the grain ripened, the people gathered not as laborers, but as kin. Sickles flashed in the sun, songs carried across the golden air, and laughter mingled with the rustle of wheat. The harvest was a ritual of unity, a sacred act disguised as work. Every bundle of grain was a shared prayer for survival. After the gathering came the feast. Bread was broken, ale poured, and for one night, even the poorest sat beside the richest. The boundaries that defined rank and duty blurred under firelight. They ate not as peasants or masters, but as one body, the living continuation of all who had come before. The feast was more than celebration. It was memory made tangible. It reminded them that survival was a circle, not a ladder. Seasons dictated not only labor but faith. The passing of winter into spring was not just a change in weather, it was a rebirth. They watched for signs in the fields, in the behavior of animals, in the color of dawn. These were not mere superstitions but forms of listening, ways of aligning the human heartbeat with the rhythm of the earth. They marked the solstices with bonfires, the equinoxes with offerings of grain and honey. In every ritual was a whisper, the earth gives, but only if we give in return. Even when the church rose to claim authority over faith, the old customs never fully disappeared. The villagers still danced around fires on midsummer nights, still left bread for unseen spirits who guarded the fields. Christianity gave them new names for ancient gods, but the soul of the rituals remained unchanged. Beneath the surface of prayer and hymn, there pulsed a truth as old as the soil. They were all part of something that breathed with them, watched with them, and would remember them when they were gone. The wheel of the year was their calendar, and every spoke of it carried purpose. Spring demanded planting, summer demanded work, autumn demanded gratitude, and winter demanded faith. In the long cold months, they relied on each other as much as on their stores of food. Neighbors shared what they could, traded warmth for kindness, labor for protection. The act of visiting another's hearth in winter was as sacred as any sermon, a reminder that fire shared was life multiplied. When a child was born, the entire village gathered to welcome it. When someone died, they gathered again to ensure the soul found peace. Every stage of life was witnessed, marked, and carried by the collective. Loneliness was rare, not because people were never alone, but because they understood that no life belonged only to itself. Even those who had little gave something: a loaf of bread, a song, a prayer. Giving was not charity, it was how the circle stayed unbroken. Trust was their invisible law. It bound the farmer to the blacksmith, the shepherd to the baker, the midwife to the mason. A loaf baked by one woman fed 10 families. A plough repaired by one man saved a harvest. There was no written contract, no ledger of debts. Memory was enough. The elders remembered who had given, who had helped, who had broken faith. History was not kept in ink, but in the eyes of those who lived it. And yet, even in such unity, tension always lurked. The fear of betrayal haunted every exchange, for one dishonest act could ripple through the fragile web that held them together. A stolen loaf, a broken promise, it was never small. It was a wound in the body of the community. But when wounds appeared, the village healed them together. Confession before neighbors was a ritual as binding as confession before priests. They forgave because they had to. Grudges were luxuries for safer times. There were festivals when the balance between survival and celebration blurred. On those nights, the villagers wore masks and reversed roles. The Lord's servant might become king for an evening, and the poorest farmer might drink from the Lord's cup. These moments of inversion allowed them to laugh at the hierarchy that ruled their lives. In laughter, the tension dissolved, and trust was renewed. The morning always returned them to their stations, but for a night, they were reminded that beneath the layers of duty, all shared the same fragile existence. To live in this world was to understand one truth deeply: the self could not survive without the whole. Each man's hunger was everyone's concern. Each woman's grief belonged to the community. They lived within a shared heartbeat, one that slowed and quickened with the rhythm of the seasons. When the harvest was good, joy was communal. When famine struck, the suffering was collective. Survival was not a personal triumph, it was a shared vow. The modern world has forgotten this rhythm, mistaking independence for strength. But in those small villages, people knew that strength was found in surrender, in allowing others to hold part of your life. They did not build empires, they built bonds. Their wealth lay not in coins, but in faces known and trusted. In a world without banks or governments, survival depended on one word: trust. And through that trust, something sacred took root. A quiet resilience that outlasted wars, famines, and the passing of empires. It was a way of being that made humanity indestructible, for when people live in rhythm with one another, the world itself feels less hostile. Every sunrise becomes a shared miracle, every hardship a collective trial. As the fires of the village fade into embers, and the songs of harvest turn to silence, we sense a deeper layer beneath their unity, something unseen that binds not just hands and hearts, but spirits. For in their rituals of survival lay the first whispers of faith, the sense that beyond the visible world, another rhythm watched and answered. And it is there, in that unseen current, that the next chapter begins. When the world grew dark, faith became its lantern. For those who lived in the shadow of uncertainty, the unseen was not distant. It breathed beside them, whispered through the wind, and stirred in the silence between heartbeats. To survive the night, they had to believe in more than the dawn. They had to believe that something watched over them, something older than kings or kingdoms, older even than fear itself. In the dim glow of the hearth, stories became shields. Each tale of saint and spirit was a map through the invisible. The peasants knew the world was alive with presences good and ill, kind and cruel, and their faith was not a thing of temples, but of thresholds and fields. A cross carved into a doorframe might keep evil from crossing. A whispered prayer at the birth of day might ensure the sun returned. To modern eyes, these gestures look like superstition, but to them, they were survival itself, small negotiations with a vast and unpredictable universe. Their world was not divided neatly between the sacred and the profane. The divine did not live only in churches. It lived in storms, in sickness, in the flicker of candlelight on stone walls. The same God who blessed the harvest could strike it with frost. Angels guarded the sky, but devils wandered the roads. Between these forces, humanity stood trembling but resolute, learning to read meaning in every shadow. Life was a constant dialogue with the unseen, and the price of silence was misfortune. Fear was not weakness, it was awareness. The people of the Middle Ages understood fear as a kind of wisdom, a reminder that life hung by a thread. The night was full of whispers and sounds that reason could not explain. The creak of wood that might be a spirit, the cry of an animal that might be an omen. They lit candles not only for light, but to keep the darkness listening. Their prayers were both hope and warning, a signal to the world beyond that they remembered their place within it. In monasteries, monks spoke of God in Latin, their voices rising like smoke. But outside those walls, the villagers prayed in their own tongue, using words older than scripture. They prayed to saints who resembled their ancestors, to the Virgin who felt like a mother, to spirits of river and forest who still answered if one listened kindly. Christianity and older belief did not fight, they merged, like two rivers flowing into one another, their waters inseparable. Faith was a language of adaptation, as flexible as it was fervent. Even time itself was holy. Each hour belonged to a prayer, each day to a saint, each season to a divine rhythm. Bells marked the passing of life, morning work, midday rest, evening forgiveness. The ringing was more than signal, it was heartbeat. When bells stopped, it meant danger, a world unanchored. In those moments, people turned to one another, whispering blessings over bread, tracing circles in the air to remind themselves that chaos could still be contained. Their faith was tactile. They touched it, carried it, wore it. A small charm around the neck, a bit of blessed wax under the bed, a relic hidden in a pouch. Each object was a promise that they were not alone. Even the poorest could own protection. A simple twig, carved with care, might hold as much power as gold, if the belief behind it was strong enough. It was not the object but the conviction that gave comfort, and in that conviction lay their endurance. Dreams, too, were sacred. People woke from them, not refreshed, but warned. They believed sleep was a journey through the veil, a place where the soul wandered freely. A bad dream could be an omen, a vision, a calling. They spoke of visits from ancestors, of glimpses of paradise or the abyss. Dreams gave meaning to what could not be seen by daylight, and each morning was an interpretation, a quiet attempt to translate eternity into words. Even the landscape itself was infused with spirit. Trees had guardians, wells had voices, and crossroads belonged to no one, for they were where worlds met. Travelers left tokens at such places, a coin, a flower, a whispered name, not offerings of fear, but acknowledgments of mystery. The peasants lived within an animate universe where everything was alive, and in that awareness, they found reverence rather than arrogance. They did not seek to rule the world, they sought to live within its moods. There was comfort in believing that pain had purpose. Disease was a trial of faith, hunger, a reminder of humility. When a child fell ill, families did not curse fate, they lit candles, made offerings, and waited for signs. To us, their patience might seem like resignation, but to them, it was strength. They endured not by denial, but by meaning. Suffering, they believed, could carve the soul into something closer to divine understanding. Their hope was not for freedom from hardship, but for grace within it. At night, the village might gather in a single hall, where a traveling friar told stories of miracles and visions. The listeners, wrapped in blankets, leaned close to the fire as he spoke of saints who walked on water, or whose tears turned to pearls. These stories were not entertainment, they were survival lessons in disguise. Each miracle reminded them that the world still cared, that the divine still looked upon them. When the storyteller's voice faded, the silence felt softer, the darkness less heavy. The boundary between faith and fear was delicate. To believe too little was dangerous. To believe too much could be madness. Somewhere between the two lay balanced the space where awe lived. And awe was their compass. It guided them through storms and famine, through sickness and death. Awe told them that even when the world seemed cruel, it was still alive with purpose. To survive, they built invisible shelters as carefully as their homes of mud and straw. They kept faith like one keeps a fire shielded from wind, fed by small offerings, tended through the coldest hours. And when dawn came, it was not taken for granted. Each sunrise was proof that their prayers had been heard, that something beyond the visible had granted them one more day. Their world may seem distant, but the impulse remains. In our own sleepless nights, when silence feels too large and the future uncertain, we, too, reach for something unseen, a name, a thought, a whisper to the dark. The medieval peasants were not naive, they were profoundly human. Their faith was not escape, it was endurance, shaped by necessity and wonder alike. And so, in that delicate space between shadow and hope, their spirit endured. It was not stone or sword that kept them alive, but belief itself, a force as invisible as air, yet as vital. And it is from this faith, this unseen bond between fear and reverence, that the rituals of survival would emerge. Small, sacred acts that turned the mysterious into the manageable, and the unknown into meaning. In the quiet corners of medieval life, there existed a wisdom that neither church nor scholar could fully claim. It was a knowledge whispered, not written, a language of herbs, roots, and symbols that passed from one generation to the next. To the villagers, it was life itself. To the priests, it was often suspicion. To later historians, it was superstition. Yet beneath the layers of fear and faith, this hidden practice stood as one of humanity's oldest sciences, practiced in secret by those who refused to forget how the earth heals. When sickness came, there were no hospitals, no sterile rooms, no doctors in white. There was only the healer, the woman with calloused hands and a garden that never slept. She knew the seasons of every leaf, the moods of every root. Her hut smelled of smoke and thyme, and on her shelves hung bundles of dried plants that looked ordinary but could, in her hands, draw poison from the body or calm the madness of fever. She was not a magician, though the villagers sometimes thought her one. She was a keeper of balance, walking the line between faith and experiment, between prayer and potion. People came to her in the night, whispering their ailments. A mother with a sick child, a farmer struck by a wasting cough, a soldier wounded in silence. She listened, nodded, and chose her herbs carefully: willow for pain, yarrow for wounds, sage for cleansing. To outsiders it looked like ritual, but every choice carried logic born of centuries of observation. These healers, dismissed as witches or wise women, were the custodians of empirical knowledge disguised in superstition. Their cauldrons were laboratories, their prayers, incantations of focus and intent. The church tolerated them only in shadows. Too much success made them dangerous, too much failure made them heretics. Yet even priests sought them quietly when fever struck their flocks. The contradiction was an open secret. While sermons condemned witchcraft, faith in the healer's touch never waned. The villagers saw no conflict in lighting a candle for Saint Apollonia and drinking a tea of crushed mint and honey. They believed both powers worked together, the divine and the earthly, the miraculous and the measurable. Science and magic were not enemies then, they were twins, separated only by language. The medieval world did not draw the hard line that modernity insists upon. To them, the world itself was alive, its plants, stones, and waters infused with essence. Healing was not about chemistry, but harmony. A cure was not merely a change of the body, but the restoration of balance between the human spirit and the natural order. When someone fell ill, it was believed that something spiritual, moral, or elemental had slipped out of tune. The healer's task was to realign it, through herbs, touch, and faith. And so, their craft evolved from observation and awe alike. They noticed how willow bark eased pain, how mold on bread healed infection, how nettles strengthened blood. They couldn't explain why, but they didn't need to. What they called virtue, we now call chemical compound. What they named charm, we now call placebo. Perhaps the difference lies not in the results, but in the language used to describe them. Was it magic, or science the world wasn't ready to understand? Each plant held its own mythology. Mandrake, shaped like the human body, was said to scream when pulled from the earth. Belladonna, beautiful and deadly, carried both medicine and curse in a single leaf. Elder trees guarded the line between life and death. To cut one carelessly was to invite misfortune. Even humble garlic, hung above doorways, was both cure and ward. The healers moved through this living library with reverence, collecting remedies that were equal parts prayer and experiment. Their knowledge often came from fragments of ancient Rome and Greece texts half remembered, copied by monks who did not understand their meaning. Galen's anatomy, Hippocrates' humors, these ideas mixed with pagan memory and Christian faith, creating a strange but functional medicine. The healer might chant a psalm while grinding herbs, believing the sound itself lent power to the cure. To modern ears, it may sound like ritual, yet the rhythm of the chant steadied the hand, the breath, the mind. It was focus disguised as devotion. In towns, early apothecaries emerged, men who combined trade with curiosity, measuring powders and distilling liquids in glass flasks. Their shelves gleamed with jars of color, ground sapphire for sight, powdered coral for the heart, mercury for cleansing. Many of their experiments failed, some killed. But from those failures, medicine began to crawl out of mystery. Still, even these early chemists kept charms above their doors, unwilling to risk the envy of unseen forces. Knowledge, no matter how rational, still bent its knee to the unknown. The line between healing and heresy was perilously thin. A woman who saved too many lives might be accused of serving the devil. A man who studied anatomy too deeply risked excommunication. And yet, curiosity persisted. They dissected animals in secret, mapped the veins of plants, and watched how wounds closed beneath certain poultices. Each discovery, no matter how small, was a quiet defiance of ignorance. The age called dark was full of flickering lights, small minds burning brightly against the vast night of fear. The peasants, too, learned from this hidden science. They carried talismans of protection, small bags of herbs tied with string, worn beneath clothing. Some believed these amulets held the breath of angels. Others saw them as barriers against disease. Children were given charms at birth, and travelers carried them across dangerous lands. These tokens were less about superstition than comfort, a tangible reminder that one could still influence fate, however slightly. Even death was treated with reverence and ritual. Herbs burned to cleanse the air, flowers placed in hands to ease passage, salt sprinkled on thresholds to keep the spirit from wandering. Each act held both meaning and medicine, an attempt to soothe the living as much as the dying. They did not fear death as we do. They negotiated with it, and in that negotiation lay understanding. To heal, for them, was not to conquer nature but to cooperate with it. The healer did not demand the body obey, she coaxed it, listening for what it already knew. She worked beside the unseen rhythms of growth and decay, and in that cooperation, she found power. She lived on the border between worlds, the physical and the mystical, the measurable and the miraculous. Centuries later, modern medicine would claim the triumph, separating science from spirit. But perhaps something was lost in the process, the reverence, the patience, the understanding that the human body is not a machine, but part of a larger mystery. The medieval healer, for all her simplicity, knew this truth instinctively. And as we trace their steps through time, we find that their world was not ignorant but intimate, a world where knowledge wore the cloak of myth, and where the difference between prayer and experiment was often just a whisper. From this delicate blend of earth and faith came the first roots of our understanding of the body itself, a knowledge forged in shadow and preserved through devotion. And it is from that same shadow that the next part of our story rises, how the human body, fragile and persistent, learned to endure the coldest nights and the harshest trials of existence. Winter was the great equalizer. When the snows came and the wind howled through thatched roofs, rank and title meant little. The cold entered every home, every bone. It pressed against the skin like a silent adversary, testing each heartbeat, each spark of fire. In those endless nights, survival was not a matter of strength or wealth. It was a lesson in patience, endurance, and cleverness. The cold was their greatest enemy, and their greatest teacher. For most, winter began long before the first snow. It started in autumn's final days, when the fields turned brittle and the sky dimmed earlier each night. Families rushed to gather what remained of the harvest. Grain was stored in wooden bins, salted meat hung from rafters, and vegetables were buried deep in cellars, cool enough to preserve them, but not cold enough to freeze. Every gesture carried weight. Every mistake could cost lives. The rhythm of survival was deliberate, slow, and exacting. When the last leaves fell, the countryside grew silent. The roads disappeared under drifts, cutting villages off from one another. Travel was rare, dangerous, and often deadly. The world shrank to the size of the home, and the fire became its sun. It was placed carefully, never in the center, but near the wall, so smoke could find its way through the roof's thatch without choking those inside. Families learned the art of fire placement as instinctively as breathing. Too much flame, and the air filled with poison. Too little, and the night crept in through the cracks. The walls of their homes were thin mud, straw, and timber, holding back the abyss of winter. To keep heat, they sealed gaps with moss or rags, sometimes even animal dung mixed with clay. It was crude, but it worked. On the coldest nights, frost bloomed on the inside of windows, tracing delicate white flowers that sparkled by firelight. Children pressed their fingers against them, amazed that beauty could come from such biting cold. Blankets were rare. Instead, they slept beneath layers of wool, old cloaks, and animal hides still smelling faintly of smoke. Beds were simple wooden frames stuffed with straw, replaced each season when it grew damp. Families slept together for warmth, parents, children, even livestock at times. A cow or goat inside the hut meant survival. Their breath alone could raise the room's temperature. The line between human and animal blurred in the struggle against frost. Warmth, not pride, determined what was proper. At night, the world outside was a black silence, broken only by the sound of shifting snow and the occasional cry of wolves. Those sounds carried far, and in them, people heard both warning and wonder. It reminded them that the wilderness was always near, patient and eternal. They did not fear it entirely, they respected it. The same forest that threatened them also provided the wood for the fire, the fur for their cloaks, the beasts that fed them when crops failed. The cold did not hate them, it tested them, and in that test, they learned how to endure. They found warmth in ingenious ways. Heated stones were placed at the foot of beds, wrapped in cloth to radiate gentle heat through the night. Water-filled pots were set by the fire to absorb warmth during the day, then carried near sleeping places when flames dimmed. Windows, if any, were shuttered with wood or sealed with animal fat to block the wind. Even the positioning of people mattered. The youngest and weakest in the middle, the strongest near the edges, guarding both warmth and family. Hunger came next. It moved slowly, like a shadow spreading across the village. The stored grain dwindled, the salted meat toughened, and the vegetables shrank to shriveled shapes in their cellars. Meals became smaller, simpler, broth stretched with herbs, bread made with coarse flour and water. The scent of stew filled the air, thin but comforting, a promise that something, however meager, still remained. They learned to eat, not to feel full, but to survive another day. Sometimes, when stores ran low, they turned to what the land offered, even in its silence, roots dug from frozen ground, bark ground into powder, lichens scraped from rocks. It was not sustenance, but defiance. They refused to surrender, even to the deepest winter. Hunger carved their bodies but sharpened their instincts. They became watchful, listening to the smallest creak of ice or the faintest rustle outside their doors. always aware that life and death lived side by side. Illness was another kind of cold one that burned from within. Coughs echoed through huts, fevers spread unseen. Without medicine, people turned again to the healers, to the herbs gathered in warmer months and dried for just this time. Thyme for breath, elderflower for fever, garlic to ward off plague. Some cures worked, others merely gave hope, but hope was medicine in itself. The body could fail, but the will to endure could not. They learned to rest not because they desired comfort, but because exhaustion could kill faster than hunger. For those who survived, winter became more than a season. It was a teacher of humility. The world reduced itself to essentials: warmth, food, breath. In that simplicity, there was strange peace. People spoke less, moved slowly, and found beauty in endurance itself. The hiss of fire on damp wood, the sound of snow sliding from the roof, the faint hum of wind through cracks, all became reminders that they were still alive. When spring finally came, it did not arrive with fanfare. It began as a subtle shift, the drip of melting icicles, the first bird call after months of silence. The villagers stepped outside, blinking against the light, and felt the air soften. Their limbs were thinner, their faces older, but their eyes brighter. They had earned this world again. Survival was no longer assumed, it was victory. The cold had taught them more than suffering, it had taught them gratitude. Every warm day was a gift, every loaf of bread a blessing, every fire a sacred thing. They did not curse winter, they respected it. For in surviving it, they had remembered what it meant to be human, to depend on one another, to work with the rhythms of nature, to endure without complaint. The modern world, wrapped in comfort, has forgotten that lesson. We chase warmth as a right, not as a reward. But for them, warmth was proof of wisdom, not wealth. They built it from nothing, learned its language, and shared it with care. The cold, in its cruelty, shaped their resilience. And as their fires burned low and the night reclaimed its silence, the people of the medieval world understood something we have long since forgotten: that survival is not the absence of hardship, but the mastery of it. From their struggle against frost and hunger, they built the foundation of endurance, a strength that would soon define not just families, but entire societies. And so, as the frost melts into streams that feed the green of spring, our story turns from the body's endurance to the balance of power, the hierarchy that determined who froze and who feasted, and how even kings could not escape the reach of winter. In the medieval world, survival was the one law that united all people. The earth did not care for titles, and the wind bowed to no crown. When winter pressed its weight upon the land, even kings shivered when the fire went out. The distance between castle and cottage, though measured in walls and wealth, was smaller than history likes to tell. Beneath the layers of silk or rags, every human body trembled the same way against the cold. In the peasant's hut, warmth came from closeness. Families huddled around their single hearth, counting breaths and sparks, watching the fire's slow decay. In the Lord's hall, the flames rose higher, licking at vast stone walls, but the heat escaped as quickly as it came. The castles, built for defense, were fortresses of chill. Their beauty was cold, their strength inhospitable. The stones that shielded them from enemies also stole their warmth. Servants hurried through endless corridors with torches that flickered uselessly against the frost. The grand chambers, hung with tapestries and furs, still echoed with the same complaint that filled every hut: the air bites. The nobles tried to outwit the cold with opulence. Their robes were layered, their hearths fed endlessly with logs carried from distant forests, their tables lined with meats and wines to thicken the blood. Yet for all their splendor, illness stalked them as faithfully as it did the poor. Draughts crept through cracks in the stone, spreading coughs that turned into fevers. The same rats that feasted on a peasant's grain found their way into royal kitchens. And when the physician's remedies failed, the noble's prayer sounded no different than a peasant's plea. Soft, desperate, whispered to the same indifferent heavens. The illusion of separation held, but only just. Nobles spoke of destiny and divine favor, believing their blood was blessed, their fortune chosen. Yet every storm that howled across their towers reminded them how fragile that blessing was. Gold could buy comfort, not control. When blizzards sealed roads, when famine emptied storerooms, when sickness swept through the servants' quarters and into the Lord's chamber, the hierarchy of the world collapsed. Hunger and fever were the great equalizers. They bowed to no man. Down in the villages, people whispered that the suffering of lords was justice, that nature had found a way to balance the scales. But even that comfort was fleeting. For when nobles grew desperate, their need turned outward. Peasants felt the pressure first. Higher taxes, heavier tithes, more grain taken from already empty stores. The struggle for survival was a chain reaction. The hunger of the powerful always fell upon the shoulders of the poor. Yet the poor endured. They always had. Still, there were moments when the line between master and servant blurred. In the darkest winters, the Lord's kitchen might open its doors to the starving. Bread was shared, not from generosity, but necessity, because hunger in the fields bred revolt, and revolt was a danger colder than any frost. The wise nobles understood this and learned the art of measured mercy. They knew that charity could be a shield as much as a virtue. In those fleeting gestures, a strange kind of unity flickered between the classes, as if the winter itself reminded everyone that survival was not the privilege of birth, but the work of endurance. Inside the castle walls, life was a dance of appearances. The lords and ladies gathered for feasts, their laughter echoing off stone while snow fell beyond the narrow windows. Music played, candles shimmered, and goblets were raised in defiance of the dark. But even as they smiled, they knew the warmth was temporary. Every flame needed tending, every banquet a cost. Servants worked unseen, feeding the fires, carrying coals, keeping the illusion of comfort alive. The nobles depended on them utterly, though few would ever say it aloud. Behind every display of wealth stood countless unseen hands. Illness blurred these hierarchies even further. The same cough could fell a baron and a beggar alike. The same chill that numbed a child's fingers in a cottage crept beneath a duchess's silken sheets. When death entered the room, it did not pause to admire rank. The medieval world lived in constant dialogue with mortality, and nowhere was the conversation more honest than during winter. In those moments, all stood equal before the same fire, the same fear, the same fragile hope that morning would come. There were times when famine struck both castle and field, and even the wealthy felt its hunger. Their banquets shrank, their wines watered down. In desperation, they sent hunters into the frozen woods, praying for deer that had long since fled. The peasants scavenged bark and roots, while the nobles sent letters to distant allies begging for grain. The difference between them was not the absence of suffering, but the illusion of control. The poor faced the world directly. The rich hid behind walls that could not save them. In spring, when the thaw returned, both classes emerged from survival's shadow. The peasants returned to the soil, the nobles to their horses and hunts. Yet winter left marks on all. Beneath the lord's jeweled rings, the fingers were thinner, the skin pale. Beneath the peasant's rags, the same gauntness, the same reminder that life was a fragile thing shared by all who breathed the same frozen air. The thaw did not erase those months, it only softened their memory. The irony of the medieval world was that those who ruled were, in their own way, the most imprisoned. Their castles were monuments to fear of invasion, of rebellion, of exposure. They built higher walls, thicker gates, deeper cellars, believing safety could be constructed. But the greater the fortress, the colder the heart within it. The peasants, bound to the land, knew at least the comfort of belonging. Their hardships were communal, their pain shared. The nobles' suffering was solitary, echoing through halls too large for warmth. The same fires that united them also revealed their difference. A peasant's hearth burned with family laughter and the smell of simple stew. A noble's blaze crackled in silence, watched by servants who dared not speak. Both fires fought the same enemy, but only one offered company. In the end, perhaps it was not wealth that defined who truly survived, but companionship. The poor could not buy comfort, but they could build it together. The medieval hierarchy, for all its rigid design, was no match for nature's impartial hand. Snow fell on manor and meadow alike. Frost touched both silk and wool. And when the nights grew longest, the most powerful men in Christendom could do nothing more than wrap themselves in blankets and hope the dawn would come. Their power ruled men, but the seasons ruled them. Even kings shivered when the fire went out. And as the embers cooled, another force waited quietly beyond their reach, an enemy even colder than winter, invisible and merciless. It would crawl through their walls, slip between breaths, and remind every soul, from peasant to prince, that the greatest threat to survival was not hunger or frost, but something far smaller and far more terrifying. It was not always the sword or the storm that ended lives in the medieval world. Sometimes death arrived silently, without warning, invisible yet undeniable. It drifted through the air, crept beneath doors, and lingered in the breath of those who prayed to be spared. They fought an enemy they couldn't see, but felt in every heartbeat. For centuries, people lived with danger that had no face. One day the village was alive with laughter. The next, a stillness spread that no one dared name. Illness began with a cough, a fever, or a small black mark that grew darker by the hour. The healers worked tirelessly, but their knowledge faltered before the scale of it. The church spoke of sin and penance, of God's anger and humanity's pride, yet even the priests fell ill. Prayers faded into silence, and the bells that once marked the hours began to toll for the dead. When the Great Plague came, it traveled faster than fear. From ports to villages, from markets to monasteries, it moved with a precision that seemed intelligent, as if the air itself had turned against mankind. The roads were lined with abandoned carts. Entire families vanished within days. Those who survived could not forget the smell, the thick, sour scent of death that clung to everything. Even the wind carried it. To live during those years was to breathe uncertainty. People watched neighbors fall, friends disappear, and the strong reduced to trembling within hours. They covered their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar, burned herbs to cleanse the air, and carried charms to ward off evil. None of it stopped the spread. They didn't understand infection, but they understood proximity, and soon even love became dangerous. Mothers avoided their children, priests refused last rites, and doors were marked with crosses not as protection, but as warnings. The famine that followed was no kinder. Fields went untilled, crops rotted where they stood, and laborers fled in search of hope that no longer existed. The rivers slowed, mills stood still, and hunger became a second plague. Bread, once a daily comfort, became memory. People ground bark into flour, boiled grass into soup. They ate to delay death, not to live. The famine did not only devour bodies, it eroded the soul. Trust withered. A neighbor's full pantry was suddenly suspect, and kindness became a luxury few could afford. Yet amid despair, a strange resilience flickered. Some learned to read the invisible signs of nature, to find nourishment where none should exist. They trapped birds, gathered roots hidden under snow, and learned that survival often meant surrendering pride. The poor became teachers of endurance. The rich, stripped of servants and luxury, learned to kneel beside them. The invisible enemy had no regard for class. It moved through castles and cottages alike, leveling the world in a way no revolution ever could. Fear reshaped faith. Some believed the plague was divine punishment. Others thought it witchcraft, or a curse born from the stars. Processions filled the streets, men whipping themselves in penance, women carrying candles through rain and ash. They begged for mercy, their chants echoing through deserted towns. But as the years passed and the suffering continued, belief shifted. God still ruled, they said, but perhaps he had turned his face away. It was a terrifying thought that heaven could be silent, that humanity was truly alone in its struggle. Still, they searched for meaning. Scholars and monks, isolated in their cloisters, began to record symptoms, patterns, and observations. They noticed that the sickness moved along trade routes, that it spared those who avoided the city's heart. Unknowingly, they were building the foundation of epidemiology, wrapped in parchment and faith. Even in devastation, the instinct to understand never died. The invisible enemy forced humanity to look closer to see that the world's smallest things could wield the greatest power. Famine and plague brought not only death, but revelation. People began to question the structures that had promised safety. If kings could not stop the pestilence, if priests could not pray it away, what then was power? In this way, the unseen enemies became mirrors, showing humanity its own vulnerability. Strength was not found in crowns or creeds, but in the quiet persistence of those who buried the dead, fed the weak, and endured. Those who survived were changed. They walked through streets once filled with life and heard only echoes. They rebuilt, but differently, smaller, humbler, more aware of how fragile everything was. They spoke softly, as if afraid to wake whatever still lingered in the air. The rhythm of life slowed. People learned to appreciate the simple act of breathing, of seeing another sunrise. Gratitude, once a ritual word in prayer, became a visceral truth. And yet, humanity adapted. The plague taught them to cleanse, to quarantine, to care with distance. The famine taught them to plan, to share, to ration with wisdom. Even despair became a teacher. It showed them that survival was not the absence of fear, but the ability to move within it. They began to see patterns in chaos, to treat illness not as punishment, but as part of nature's cycle. Out of suffering, a strange kind of knowledge emerged, one that blended observation with reverence. The invisible enemies had taken everything, families, faith, certainty, but they had also left behind a quiet gift, awareness. People began to understand that the unseen was not only to be feared, it was to be studied, respected, even harnessed. The same invisible forces that brought sickness could also bring healing, warmth, and light. The world had turned against them, yet in learning its language, they found a way to live again. We recognize this now more than ever. The same fears still echo through time, air that carries danger, touch that might harm, the unseen that divides and unites us. The medieval world is not as distant as it seems. Their invisible enemies were ours, only by different names. Their solutions, faith, cooperation, endurance, remain the same. The survivors of those centuries emerged not triumphant, but transformed. They had looked death in the eye of every shadow, and still chosen to light a candle. They understood that to live was to balance between fragility and defiance. They buried their dead with trembling hands, then planted seeds above their graves. And in time, those seeds grew. When the winds of plague finally stilled and the harvests returned, the people did not celebrate with feasts or parades. They simply began again. The act of rebuilding itself was sacred, a rebellion against despair. In every new home raised, every child born, every fire lit, the invisible enemy was answered. Because though it had taken so much, it had failed to take their will to continue. And from that will came the resilience that would carry them forward toward a world remade by endurance, faith, and the quiet strength to start again. When half the world vanished, the survivors rewrote reality. What else could they do? The air was heavy with absence, the streets hollow with the echo of names no one dared speak aloud. Death had redrawn the map of existence, leaving behind not just empty fields and villages, but a silence that begged to be filled. And so, humanity did what it has always done. In the wake of ruin, it began to tell stories. At first, the stories were simple, whispered by firelight to keep children from trembling at night. They spoke of angels walking among the living, of the righteous spared and the wicked punished. Each tale was both balm and blueprint, reshaping chaos into order. If suffering had meaning, then survival had purpose. These narratives spread faster than the plague had, carried from village to village by travelers, merchants, and monks. Every region gave the catastrophe its own face, its own lesson. In England, it was divine judgment. In Italy, a test of faith. In France, the cleansing of sin. Through story, the living gave shape to what the mind could not endure. Rituals grew out of these retellings. Bells were rung not for mourning, but remembrance. Processions wound through the streets each year, celebrating the moment the sickness had passed. In some places, survivors gathered at sunset, lighting candles for each soul lost. The flames glowed like stars scattered across the dark, each one proof that memory could outshine fear. Even the simplest act, breaking bread together, became symbolic, a quiet declaration that life still belonged to the living. Art, too, became a form of healing. In frescoes and carvings, painters filled walls with images of saints protecting the suffering, of death dancing hand in hand with the living. These were not morbid fantasies, but acknowledgments of truth, that the boundary between life and death had grown thin, and that perhaps it always was. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a favorite motif not to frighten, but to remind. No matter one's station, all would one day join the same procession. Strangely, the reminder comforted more than it condemned. In equality before death, people found a new sense of unity. From the ashes of loss, a profound empathy emerged. Villages that had once walled themselves off began to open again. Those who had survived understood the value of togetherness. To be alive was to be indebted to the neighbor who shared food, the healer who risked contagion, the stranger who buried the forgotten. The old divisions of class and faith, though never erased, blurred for a time under the weight of shared memory. Survival had humbled them all. The church, too, changed. Priests who had once thundered about wrath and punishment began to speak of compassion and renewal. The idea of purgatory, a place not of damnation, but purification, took hold. It offered hope that suffering had meaning beyond pain, that even the dead could find peace through the prayers of the living. Faith, once rigid and fearful, became tender. People began to see God not as a judge above, but as presence within the quiet endurance that had carried them through. In monasteries, a different kind of rebirth took place. The monks who had watched their brothers die by the dozens now turned their grief into purpose. They began to copy books again, not only scripture, but poetry, philosophy, and the remnants of ancient science. Each stroke of the quill was an act of defiance against oblivion. The idea of learning itself became sacred. If death had taken half the world, knowledge could rebuild the rest. The quiet scratching of ink on parchment was the sound of civilization being reborn. Outside the walls, ordinary people rebuilt with the same reverence. Fields long untended were sown again. Tools were repaired, homes rethatched, roads cleared. The rhythm of labor returned, slow but steady. Each small act, a door mended, a loaf baked, a song sung in the fields, was a way of saying, "We are still here." The world had ended, yes, but not completely. Humanity, stubborn as ever, refused to vanish. Storytelling took on new urgency. Traveling bards and poets roamed the countryside, collecting tales of loss and survival. Their songs were both memorial and medicine, transforming private grief into communal strength. Through them, memory became melody, and melody became resilience. When the people listened, they did not just remember, they rebuilt themselves from within. Words became architecture, holding together what stone and mortar could not. Even laughter returned, cautious at first, then bright. In the wake of despair, humor was rebellion, a way to mock the cruelty of fate. Folk plays emerged, filled with satire and mischief. Death itself became a character, clumsy and human, outwitted by clever peasants. These performances spread through towns like healing fire, proving that joy was the most powerful antidote to fear. Laughter, in its simplicity, declared victory over the invisible enemy that had sought to silence them. And from laughter came renewal. Children born in the years after the plague were seen as miracles, proof that life persisted no matter how dark the night. Parents named them hope, faith, or remembrance. Each new generation grew up surrounded by stories of what had been lost and what had been reclaimed. The memory of suffering became their inheritance, but so did the lesson it carried, that humanity is made not only of flesh and frailty, but of endurance written in the heart. Time, The patient healer softened the scars, but did not erase them. Centuries later, traces of the great dying remained in the architecture, in the art, in the customs of mourning and rebirth. Even the festivals of spring carried echoes of that survival. The maypole dances, the songs of renewal, the blessings of fields. What began as rituals of remembrance became celebrations of life itself. The dead were not forgotten. They were folded gently into the living's joy. In the quiet that followed catastrophe, the survivors discovered something extraordinary. They realized that rebuilding was not just about restoring what was lost, but redefining what life meant. The world had changed, and so had they. The plague had stripped away illusion, revealing what truly mattered: connection, compassion, continuity. The living were the custodians of both memory and possibility. When half the world vanished, the survivors did not merely endure, they reimagined existence. From the rubble of despair, they built cathedrals of meaning. From the silence of death, they composed symphonies of faith. And as centuries passed, the memory of that endurance became woven into the human story itself, a quiet truth that reemerges whenever the world trembles again. Because every age faces its own invisible enemies, its own reckonings, and every time, the same lesson waits beneath the fear, that even when the world seems to end, humanity will find a way to begin anew. The story of recovery was never about rebuilding walls or restoring wealth. It was about remembering who we are when everything else is gone. The survivors of the medieval world understood that better than anyone. They looked at the emptiness around them and saw not ruin, but room for new stories, new faith, new beginnings. And somewhere, deep within that renewed faith, the seeds of forbidden knowledge began to stir again, whispered in monasteries, hidden in books, carried in dreams. The world was healing, but curiosity was waking. What they had once feared to know, they now longed to rediscover. And that quiet hunger for understanding, for truth long buried, would soon ignite the next chapter of their journey. In the silence of candlelight, the world's lost knowledge whispered on. While the great cities crumbled and empires forgot their own tongues, a few quiet minds kept the memory of reason alive. Their names are mostly lost monks, wanderers, hermits, but their devotion shaped the world that would follow. In an age where ignorance seemed triumphant, they guarded fragments of the old brilliance, passing it hand to hand, word to word, as though carrying embers through a long and endless night. Inside cold stone monasteries, far from the noise of kingdoms, the rhythm of preservation never stopped. The monks worked in silence, their quills scratching across vellum, copying what they barely understood. Astronomy, medicine, geometry, the philosophies of Greece and Rome, all translated, annotated, hidden again. They wrote by the dim light of candles made from their own tallow, the wax melting as time itself seemed to drip onto the pages. To them, this work was prayer. The act of preserving truth became a form of worship, faith expressed not through preaching, but through remembering. The scriptorium smelled of ink, dust, and devotion. Some of the texts were sacred, others forbidden. In margins, monks scribbled their doubts, their interpretations, their small rebellions against ignorance. "The stars are his handwriting," one wrote, gazing through the narrow slit of a monastery window at the constellations beyond. Another, more daring, noted the orbit of a wandering star, a forbidden curiosity, for to question the heavens was to question divine design. Yet curiosity survived. It always does. Beyond the walls, knowledge took other shapes. Traveling healers carried fragments of forgotten wisdom disguised as folklore. A charm for fever might hide a recipe for herbal medicine. A lullaby might encode astronomical patterns once known by scholars of Alexandria. These were not accidents. They were deliberate disguises, ways to keep learning alive in a world that feared it. For the common folk, knowledge was power, and power invited danger. Better to cloak it in song, in story, in superstition. Merchants and pilgrims became the accidental librarians of the Middle Ages. As they crossed continents, they carried ideas as easily as they carried spices or silk. A remedy from Arabia found its way into an English apothecary. A navigational chart from Byzantium was copied by a monk in France. The world was scattered, but its mind remained connected through these secret pathways. Across deserts and seas, fragments of wisdom traveled like seeds on the wind, waiting for new soil to take root. Somewhere, in a mountain monastery, a monk read by lamplight about the motion of the planets, unaware that his hands preserved knowledge already 1,000 years old. Somewhere else, a wandering scholar memorized the formulas of alchemists, reciting them in code so no inquisitor could accuse him of sorcery. The old world had not vanished, it had simply gone underground, waiting for the noise of history to fade. It was said that certain monasteries possessed libraries so vast they seemed impossible for the age hidden, archives beneath cloisters, rooms sealed behind altars, shelves of manuscripts locked away from the eyes of the uninitiated. Some claimed these vaults contained maps of the world before the flood, blueprints of lost machines, and writings from civilizations erased from memory. Perhaps these are only legends, born from our longing to believe the past was greater than we imagine. Yet legends, like the texts they echo, often hide a kernel of truth. The monks who guarded these secrets did not always understand their contents. A page of mathematical symbols might be mistaken for a prayer. A diagram of the stars might be interpreted as a divine sign. And yet, in their faithfulness, they preserved knowledge beyond their comprehension, like bees guarding honey they would never taste. It is one of history's quiet miracles. Wisdom protected by those who sought only to serve God, not reason. In hidden corners of Europe, others kept their own flames alive. The alchemists, cloaked in mystery, spoke of transformation, of turning base metal into gold, of discovering the elixir of life. But behind their metaphors lay genuine experiments in chemistry and physics. They studied reactions, measured weights, observed change. They sought the divine in matter itself, believing that creation and transformation were reflections of the same truth. Their laboratories, lit by flickering lamps, were small universes, places where curiosity could still breathe. Even farmers, illiterate and bound to the soil, held their own form of knowledge. They tracked the stars to mark planting seasons, watched the flight of birds to predict weather, and studied the color of soil to measure fertility. Their science was simple, but profound, born not from books, but from living with the land. In their fields, they practiced astronomy, meteorology, and ecology, long before such words existed. They, too, preserved understanding, though no ink ever captured it. The true strength of hidden knowledge was its invisibility. It could not be conquered because it could not be seen. The conqueror might burn libraries and hang heretics, but he could not erase memory. Ideas are like roots, they grow back in darkness, deeper and stronger, and when the time is right, they break the surface again, green and unstoppable. As centuries passed, whispers of lost wisdom stirred curiosity anew. Travelers returned from the east with strange instruments, astrolabes, compasses, lenses that bent light. Scholars rediscovered forgotten names, Aristotle, Galen, Euclid. To the church, these were dangerous awakenings. To thinkers, they were divine revelations. The ancient world, long buried beneath superstition, began to speak again, and those who listened felt as though hearing echoes from another age, voices that had waited patiently through silence to be heard once more. Still, not all knowledge was meant to be found. Some texts were locked away deliberately, their wisdom deemed too powerful or heretical. The idea that man might measure the heavens, or heal without prayer, was unsettling. It suggested a world governed not by miracle, but by law, a world that could be understood, and therefore challenged. To preserve order, some knowledge remained forbidden, hidden even from those who preserved it. The monks became both protectors and wardens, their libraries both sanctuaries and prisons. Yet the silence could not hold forever. The ink that had dried under candlelight would one day guide explorers across oceans, physicians through epidemics, astronomers toward the stars. Every page copied in devotion, every fragment whispered in secret, was a thread in the tapestry of renewal. The medieval mind, so often dismissed as blind faith, had quietly prepared the foundation of rediscovery. In the stillness of those candlelit rooms, something greater than memory endured. It was the conviction that truth, however buried, cannot die. The world had turned its back on knowledge, yet knowledge had waited, patient and invisible. And as dawn finally broke over the long night of the Middle Ages, those waiting fragments of wisdom would rise again, shaping the modern world that thought itself new. The keepers of forgotten truth had done their work well. Their voices were gone, their names erased. But their light remained hidden, in ink, in song, in the rhythm of curiosity itself. And from those hidden embers, humanity would soon remember what it had lost. The power not just to survive, but to understand. What if the Dark Ages weren't dark at all? What if, beneath the soot and silence of history, a quiet brilliance still burned hidden in the clatter of forges, the scent of herbs, the creak of wooden gears turning beneath candlelight? For centuries, we've been told that the medieval world was a pause in progress, a long sleep between Rome and the Renaissance. But that story, like so many others, may only be half true. In villages and monasteries, craftsmen and thinkers worked with a precision that defies the label of primitive. Their hands shaped metal and wood, with an understanding that no book recorded. In smoky workshops, they smelted iron, cast bronze, and experimented with alloys that modern metallurgists still study with wonder. A single blacksmith could repair plows, forge tools, and craft weapons capable of lasting generations. Without machines or measurements, they achieved a balance of strength and flexibility that even today remains difficult to replicate. Their secret was not technology, it was intuition, the ancient dialogue between fire and hand. The forge was both laboratory and altar. The blacksmith stood before the flames like a priest before mystery, reading color as others read scripture. The metal glowed red, then orange, then white, the hues marking stages of transformation. Each sound, the hiss of water, the clang of hammer on anvil, was part of a language older than writing. To shape metal was to mimic creation itself, to turn chaos into form. The blacksmiths guarded their methods fiercely. They spoke of their craft in riddles and symbols, teaching only through apprenticeship, never through words. Knowledge was protection, and protection was survival. Their secrets extended beyond weapons. In some valleys, craftsmen created clockwork automata, small figures that moved through hidden gears and weights. They were marvels of imagination, angels that turned their heads to ring bells, birds that flapped mechanical wings. Such inventions were not common, yet they proved that curiosity had not died with Rome. These early engineers understood motion, balance, and timing in ways that foreshadowed the machines of centuries to come. But their genius was often veiled in religion. To admit that a man could imitate life too closely was dangerous, so they called it devotion art, not science. The builders of cathedrals carried similar secrets. We still marvel at the impossibility of their work, towers rising like prayers, arches so precise that they stand after 1,000 winters. These masons had no blueprints, only string, chalk, and sight, yet somehow they calculated weight, pressure, and symmetry with astonishing accuracy. Modern engineers study their methods and still find mystery. Some claim geometry alone explains it. Others suspect something deeper, a lost understanding of resonance, of sound and vibration woven into stone. Each cathedral was more than architecture. It was a frequency, tuned to the faith of a people who built not for years, but for eternity. Equally mysterious was the craft of the herbalists and apothecaries, those quiet alchemists of the body. Their shelves held the memory of forests, the oils, roots, and powders that could calm pain, heal wounds, or draw out fever. Modern medicine dismisses much of their practice as myth, yet we still rediscover their truths. Willow bark as the source of aspirin, foxglove as a remedy for the heart, honey as an antibiotic. Their potions, labeled as superstition, were the groundwork of pharmacology, and though they spoke of magic, what they truly practiced was observation refined through generations. The forest was their library, each plant a page written in scent and color. The weaving of textiles, too, carried unspoken science. Women at looms knew how to spin fibers to withstand water, fire, and time. Dyes made from rare plants and crushed minerals held their color for centuries. The shimmering blues of medieval tapestries were made from lapis lazuli, carried from Afghanistan across deserts and seas, proof that even in isolation, trade and innovation still connected the world. Every thread told a story of endurance, of craft as communication across impossible distances. Even agriculture, so often portrayed as stagnant, was alive with invention. Farmers experimented with crop rotation long before the term existed, restoring fertility to their fields by intuition. They built windmills to harness air, watermills to harness rivers, and simple gears that multiplied human strength. They may not have written treatises, but they engineered survival with remarkable skill. When famine came, they adapted. When drought came, they dug deeper. Theirs was innovation born of necessity, not ambition. And yet, these achievements rarely entered the chronicles of the time. History, written by the wealthy and the powerful, cared little for the work of peasants and artisans. Knowledge that was practical, local, or domestic slipped between the cracks of recorded memory. What the chroniclers called darkness was often the absence of attention, not the absence of light. The true science of the medieval world was hidden in plain sight in the rhythm of hammers, the scent of boiling herbs, the spinning of wheels powered by unseen streams. Occasionally, the veil lifted. A traveling scholar might describe a water-powered sawmill or a village clock that measured time by dripping mercury. A nobleman might fund the construction of a mysterious machine, then quietly hide it when the church questioned its purpose. Some inventions vanished as quickly as they appeared, destroyed not by failure, but by fear. The world was not ready to embrace knowledge that blurred the line between man and miracle. Yet the ideas persisted, carried in whispers, hidden in manuscripts, or encoded in symbols that only the initiated could read. We forget how much of the modern world was born from these shadows. The compass, rediscovered and refined. The glass lens, crafted for devotion but destined for discovery. The mechanical clock, first built to mark hours of prayer, later to measure the motion of the heavens. Each innovation emerged not in daylight, but in twilight, a balance of faith and curiosity, of secrecy and revelation. To call these centuries dark is to mistake humility for ignorance. The people of that time did not lack understanding, they lacked permission. Knowledge was dangerous because it implied freedom. To know too much was to risk accusation, to be branded heretic, sorcerer, or worse. So they hid their discoveries beneath symbols, blending craft with devotion until the two were indistinguishable. The world's progress continued, but beneath the surface, quiet as roots beneath frost. And perhaps that is how it was meant to be. For knowledge that survives, suppression becomes stronger, wiser, more deliberate. The crafts of the medieval age were not lost, they were distilled, condensed into forms that could endure the weight of fear. When the world was ready to awaken, these secrets would rise again, reborn as art, science, and philosophy. What if the dark ages weren't dark at all? What if they were the deep breath before the next great dawn, the time when humanity learned that wisdom grows best in silence? The echoes of that silence still linger in our architecture, our tools, our medicines. Each innovation of the modern world carries a whisper from those forgotten forges and hidden gardens. Theirs was not the age of ignorance, but of guardianship. And as time moved forward, their patience became legacy, the bridge between survival and enlightenment. And so, from the shadows of craft and curiosity, we move toward what remained after them, the echoes of memory itself, the songs and symbols that carried their wisdom through centuries. Disguised as myth, yet alive as ever. When writing was forbidden, they sang the truth instead. In an age when ink was rare and books were guarded like relics, memory became humanity's library. The wisdom of generations passed not through parchment, but through voice, through songs whispered by firesides, stories shared beneath the stars, and symbols carved in wood or stone. Long before the printing press, the human mind was the vessel of civilization, and the tongue was its pen. The medieval world thrived on spoken truth. In villages where few could read, the storytellers were historians, teachers, and entertainers all at once. They carried not just tales, but codes, lessons hidden in rhythm and rhyme. To forget a story was to lose a piece of the world. To tell it again was to renew it. And so, people remembered through melody and metaphor, transforming survival into art. In the fields, peasants sang while they worked, the cadence of their songs matching the swing of the sickle or the stomp of the millstone. Their lyrics seemed simple about harvest, love, and rain, but beneath them lay instructions. One song might teach when to sow and when to rest. Another might hide a warning of famine or plague. These melodies became repositories of knowledge, wrapped in beauty so they would never be lost. The voice itself was a form of protection memory carried on breath, impervious to fire or decay. In every region, these oral traditions took on local color. The Celtic bards, with their harps and haunting refrains, preserved lineages and battles stretching back centuries. The Norse skalds sang sagas that blended history with prophecy, keeping alive the deeds of their ancestors long after the names of kings had turned to dust. Even in the remotest hamlets of Europe, travelers could find the same stories told in different tongues like threads of a single tapestry, spread wide but still connected. The church, wary of the power of the spoken word, tried to regulate what could be told. Some stories were baptized into saints' legends, others were branded as heresy. Yet the people's voices could not be contained. Beneath every pious parable, older gods whispered. The tale of Saint Bridget carried echoes of the goddess who once bore her name. The dragon slain by Saint George resembled ancient serpents from pagan creation myths. The people didn't abandon their old stories, they transformed them, wrapping forbidden truths in acceptable forms. It was rebellion disguised as devotion. Symbols became another kind of memory, a language that required no words. We see them still woven into embroidery, carved into beams, hidden in the corners of churches. Spirals, knots, suns, and serpents, remnants of ideas too powerful to die. The illiterate peasants who carved them may not have known their origins, yet they sensed their meaning. These symbols connected the visible and the invisible, the sacred and the everyday. Each was a seed of continuity, carrying the past through the veil of time. Even the architecture spoke. In cathedral glass, ancient geometry whispered through color and light. The masons who built those vast sanctuaries hid messages in their stones, patterns that aligned with constellations, proportions drawn from mathematics older than the Bible. They worked under the church's banner, but left signatures that pointed to something universal, something beyond doctrine. The sacred buildings were more than houses of worship. They were memory made visible, the echo of forgotten knowledge embedded in stone. Folktales served a similar purpose. On the surface, they were stories for children, talking animals, witches in the woods, heroes who ventured into darkness. But beneath the surface, they encoded warnings and wisdom. "Don't stray from the path," said Little Red Riding Hood. But the path was not merely the road. It was the moral course of life. "Don't eat the fruit," said another tale. "Don't make a bargain in the forest." The listeners learned survival not just in the world of men, but in the realm of spirit. Each myth was a compass disguised as a bedtime story. In some cultures, the act of storytelling itself became sacred ritual. A tale could not be told without an offering bread, salt, a spark from the hearth given to the spirits who kept memory alive. To speak was to summon. The storyteller was both performer and priest, invoking the presence of ancestors with every word. The listeners sat still, aware that they were not merely hearing a story, but participating in something ancient, a ceremony that bridged the living and the dead. This oral tradition was also democracy in disguise. It gave voice to those whom history refused to write about. The poor, the outcast, the women who tended herbs and delivered children all could shape legend through word and song. Their truths lived not in chronicles, but in the collective memory of those who listened. While kings carved their victories in stone, the people wove theirs into melody, ensuring that their version of the world would outlast the monuments of power. Over generations, memory shifted and merged. The storyteller forgot one line, invented another, and so each retelling became a reinvention. Fact became myth, myth became faith, and faith became history once more. This constant transformation was not decay, it was evolution. The stories adapted to survive the centuries, just as the people did. The details changed, but the essence endured. The reminder that truth does not need to be written to be real. When disaster struck, famine, plague, invasion, the storytellers preserved not only the events, but the emotions of survival. They recorded grief and resilience in tone and pause, in the trembling of the voice. In times when no one dared to write of the world's cruelty, the songs remembered it for them. That is why so many medieval laments still move us today. They carry the echo of humanity's oldest feeling, that life, even in darkness, must be witnessed. In this way, the oral tradition became the spine of civilization. It bound the centuries together, uniting the learned and the unlettered, the sacred and the profane. Even when literacy spread, the voice remained the heart of culture. For what is a book but a silent echo of speech? What is history but a story someone once dared to tell aloud? When writing was forbidden, they sang the truth instead. And in doing so, they ensured that no decree, no flame, no conqueror could erase what lived in memory. The songs, symbols, and myths carried their wisdom safely through the ages, hiding it in plain sight. Centuries later, when scholars began to study these tales again, they found more than superstition. They found fragments of astronomy, traces of migration, hints of lost civilizations, and forgotten knowledge. The oral world, dismissed as fantasy, was in truth an archive, coded, resilient, and alive. And so, from the voices of the past, we begin to hear the first whispers of something larger. The myths that survived were not merely moral lessons. They were keys, maps to a world that may have existed before the flood of history, a world remembered not in ink, but in song. And as those songs travel through time, we follow their trail into the deeper mysteries of what humanity remembers and what it dares not write down. Were their myths memories of a world before ours? The stories that survived the Middle Ages, those songs and legends whispered from one generation to the next, carried echoes too ancient to belong entirely to their time. Beneath the surface of saints and monsters, of dragons and miracles, lingered something older, a faint vibration of remembrance, a rumor that history was not the first chapter of humankind, but merely one of its many retellings. The peasants who sang around fires and the monks who wrote by candlelight did not think of themselves as inventors of myth. They were curators of something inherited, something that reached beyond the borders of written time. When they spoke of giants shaping the mountains or floods swallowing kingdoms, they were not imagining, they were remembering. The past, for them, was not a straight line. It was a circle, a pattern that returned again and again, each age rising from the bones of the one before it. The medieval world was haunted by memory it did not understand. In Icelandic sagas, giants walked among men, building fortresses and carving valleys with their hands. In Celtic legend, islands of glass floated beyond the horizon, home to the dead and the divine. Beneath English hills, the stories said, slept ancient kings who would wake when the world needed them most. The church called these tales superstition, but the people clung to them, sensing that truth sometimes hides best behind wonder. It was as if humanity carried in its imagination the fossil record of forgotten ages. The flood myths, for instance, told in Europe, Mesopotamia, India, and the Americas, each spoke of waters rising, of a world washed clean and reborn. Could so many distant peoples have invented the same catastrophe, or were they describing a memory passed down in dream and song? The medieval mind did not question such things. To them, the flood was both punishment and promise, the proof that destruction always carried the seed of renewal. Other myths spoke of lands that vanished. Sailors told of islands glimpsed at sunset that disappeared by morning, of cities swallowed by the sea. They called them Lyonesse, Is, Contra Guelord, names now fading on the edges of maps. Across the world, the same stories repeated. Atlantis in the west, Lemuria in the east, Hyperborea in the north. Places where gods and men once lived side by side, where knowledge was pure and the air itself glowed. The medieval storytellers did not know these names, yet their legends hummed with the same melody. It was as if memory itself was trying to speak, using 1,000 different voices to tell one story, that the world had been remade before, and might be again. Giants filled these tales, not monsters, but ancestors. They were said to have built the standing stones and shaped the hills. In Ireland, the giant's causeway was proof of their hands. In England, the chalk figure of the long man watched eternally from the hillside. Even in the Bible, the Nephilim, those mysterious sons of God, hinted at a race both human and divine. To medieval listeners, these stories were not fantasy but inheritance. They were the echoes of a time when humanity was closer to the stars, when power flowed not through machines but through understanding. And there were whispers too, of cataclysms of fire from the sky, of winters that never ended. Chroniclers wrote of a sun that did not rise for 18 months, of stars that fell like embers from heaven. The learned men blamed eclipses or comets, but the people remembered differently. They said the world had burned once, then drowned, then frozen, and that each time only a few were spared to begin anew. These were not prophecies, they were recollections. The line between future and past blurred until both became one repeating dream. In their folk tales, this cycle took the shape of prophecy. The sleeping king who would return, the phoenix rising from its ashes, the world tree that died and bloomed again. Such stories comforted the living, assuring them that even when the world seemed lost, something always endured. The pattern of endings and beginnings was woven into their souls. They sensed, perhaps, that the rhythm of time itself was not progress, but breath and inhalation and exhalation of creation. Even the architecture of myth reflected this. The sacred mountains where gods were said to dwell, the towers that reached toward heaven, the labyrinths that spiraled inward, all mirrored the human journey. Ascent, descent, return. The storytellers may not have known it, but they were describing not only the cosmos but the psyche. The lost worlds they spoke of were both external and internal, the landscapes of collective memory. It is tempting to dismiss these tales as coincidence or imagination, yet when we look closely, we find patterns too precise to ignore. Why do flood myths, sky gods, and buried giants appear in every culture? Why did the medieval peasants, isolated in their small villages, speak of golden ages long gone? Perhaps because some truths are too vast to die, they hide in the deep memory of the species, resurfacing when the world is ready to listen. The monks who recorded these stories may not have believed them literally, but even they sensed a mystery beneath. In their illuminated manuscripts, dragons coil around the edges of scripture, guarding secrets between the lines. Margins filled with strange creatures, half human, half divine, seem to wink at us across time, as if the artists knew something they could not say aloud. The world's myths were not distractions from faith. They were reminders of something faith itself had forgotten, that history is only one layer of the real. Were their myths memories of a world before ours? Perhaps they were not memories at all, but instructions, warnings written in story form. Each legend carried a moral not just about human nature, but about human cycles. The rise and fall of pride, the balance between creation and destruction, the cost of forgetting. The ancients may have encoded their wisdom in story so that when the next reset came, some part of their truth would survive. As centuries passed, those echoes faded into folklore, their deeper meanings buried under centuries of translation and reinterpretation. Yet something in them still stirs the imagination. We read of Atlantis and wonder why it feels familiar. We hear of the giants and feel a strange recognition, as if remembering a dream we once lived. The old myths whisper not that we come from nothing, but that we come from many beginnings. The medieval mind accepted this mystery with ease. To them, the world was layered, visible and invisible, mortal and eternal. They understood that memory was not confined to a lifetime. The earth remembered, too. The stones held their own stories, the seas their own griefs. Every legend was a conversation between humanity and the planet itself, a record of all that had been and all that would return. And as their storytellers sang of lost lands and sleeping kings, They were not mourning the past, they were preparing for the next turning of the wheel. For if the world had ended before, it could end again. But just as surely, it would begin again. These were not tales of despair, but of continuity. Myths of destruction, yes, but also of rebirth. And it is there, in that rhythm of loss and renewal, that we find the thread leading to the next chapter of the human story, the one that dares to ask not only times what was lost asterisk, but times what comes after the fall asterisk. Every civilization believes it's the last, until the next one rises. We like to think of history as a staircase, each step a triumph of progress. But the truth, whispered in every ruin and buried city, is that history moves in circles. Civilizations bloom, decay, and are born again not by chance, but by rhythm. The ancients called it the great cycle, the eternal turning of time. We call it collapse. Yet collapse is only half the story. Beneath the ashes, something always stirs an ember of memory, a spark of renewal waiting for the wind. The medieval world understood this more intimately than we do. They lived among the bones of Rome, ploughing fields where emperors once marched. Broken columns and half-buried amphitheaters stood as reminders that power is not immortal. The peasants who worked the soil saw marble statues crumble under moss and ivy, and they knew, everything built by human hands eventually returns to dust. To them, history was not progress, but a pendulum swinging between order and oblivion. Even the church, so certain of divine permanence, carried traces of this belief. In its sermons were echoes of an older truth, that the world would one day end, only to be made new again. Medieval theologians called it time's renovatio mundi, time's the renewal of the world. To them, apocalypse was not final destruction, but cleansing. Fire and flood were not punishments, they were resets. The cycle of sin and salvation mirrored the rise and fall of civilizations. Humanity, like nature, was destined to shed its skin over and over. Across time and continent, the same pattern appears. Egypt, Greece, Rome, the empires of the East, and the forgotten cities of the Americas all followed the same arc: expansion, excess, decay. Each believed it had transcended the mistakes of its predecessors. Each fell anyway. Famine, flood, greed, or plague, it hardly mattered the cause. The collapse was not the end of history. It was its heartbeat. The medieval storytellers knew this instinctively. Their myths of floods and fiery dragons were metaphors for renewal. Even the tale of Noah, or of Ragnarok in the Norse sagas, carried the same lesson. After destruction comes rebirth. The old world must die for the new one to breathe. The cycle was not to be feared but respected. Those who forgot it, those who mistook abundance for eternity, were always the first to fall. Some chroniclers even tried to measure these cycles. They noted how roughly every few centuries, the world seemed to tremble. Wars erupted, empires fractured, climates shifted. The 14th century, with its plagues and famines, was one such tremor. So was the 5th, when Rome collapsed. So was the 12th, when cities rose again. It was as though humanity moved to a hidden rhythm, an unseen metronome beating beneath the centuries. The wise listened for it, the foolish ignored it. Modern minds call it coincidence, but the medieval soul saw purpose in repetition. To them, time was not linear, but living a serpent, swallowing its own tail, a wheel turning endlessly through light and shadow. Even the seasons mirrored this truth. Spring's birth, summer's height, autumn's decay, winter's death, and then, once more, the bloom. The earth itself was a teacher, endlessly demonstrating that nothing truly ends. Everything transforms. Perhaps that is why they feared pride above all sins. Pride was not arrogance alone. It was forgetfulness, the belief that one could rise above the cycle. The kings who built fortresses of stone thought themselves eternal. The merchants who hoarded wealth believed fortune immutable. But when the frost came, or the plague arrived, or the harvest failed, the illusion shattered. The higher the tower, the longer the fall. History's lesson was simple, but often ignored. Humility sustains, hubris destroys. And yet, collapse is not cruelty. It is renewal in disguise. When empires fall, the earth reclaims what was stolen. Forests grow where palaces once stood. Rivers cut new paths through forgotten cities. Humanity, stripped of comfort, remembers its strength. The medieval world itself was born from such a reset, a civilization rebuilt atop the bones of Rome, carrying forward fragments of its wisdom, like relics of a saint. Out of ruin came rhythm. Out of silence, song. It's tempting to believe that our age is different, that our knowledge, our technology, our global reach have broken the cycle. But every age has thought the same. The Romans, too, believed their aqueducts and libraries would outlast the sky. The builders of Babylon, the philosophers of Athens, the emperors of China all declared themselves the pinnacle of history. Yet the pendulum swung, and time reset the board. The ruins remain as reminders. Permanence is the one illusion the world never stops correcting. There are moments, even now, when the pattern reveals itself again. Cities rise faster than ever, but so do the storms that threaten them. We light the night with artificial suns and call it progress, yet the same shadows linger. The names change, but the melody is the same. Prosperity invites decadence, decadence invites decay. Then the world breathes in again, clearing its lungs, readying for the next beginning. The medieval mind accepted this truth with a grace we have lost. They saw in every harvest both gift and warning. They built cathedrals not just for their generation, but for centuries unborn, knowing full well that someday those same stones would crumble. They lived within time, not above it. Their faith, for all its fear, held a strange serenity, the understanding that life's impermanence was not tragedy, but design. If we listen closely, the ruins of history speak the same message. The fallen towers, the abandoned roads, the eroded statues, all whisper, asterisk this, too, was once forever. Asterisk. Yet, from those remains, we also see what endured: the language, the stories, the knowledge carried forward by survivors. Collapse destroys the structure, not the spirit. Humanity's genius lies not in avoiding the fall, but in remembering after it. Every civilization believes it's the last, until the next one rises. Perhaps that is the hidden mercy of the cycle, the guarantee that nothing, not even despair, is permanent. When one world ends, another begins, not in grandeur, but in quiet persistence. A single seed growing through stone, a song sung by those who refuse to forget. The medieval storytellers would have understood this. To them, the end of days was not apocalypse, but renewal. The fire would cleanse, the flood would wash, and from the ashes, new hands would rebuild the world. History, they believed, was not the story of progress, but of return. The old becomes new again, the forgotten rediscovered. The world does not die, it remembers. And so the wheel turns still. Our own age, for all its brilliance, may only be another link in the endless chain, a chapter, not the conclusion. And if one day the lights go out again, and silence covers the earth, perhaps someone, somewhere, will remember us. Perhaps they will find the fragments we leave behind: our words, our art, our mistakes, and build anew, as others have before. For that is the true rhythm of existence: creation, destruction, remembrance, the heartbeat of the ages, pulsing beneath the surface of time. And from that pulse, from that endless repetition of endings and beginnings, the next story will rise, a story not of ruin, but of rebirth. From the ashes of the forgotten came the light we still live by. The world that had endured centuries of frost, famine, and fear did not simply awaken one morning to the sound of trumpets and call it the Renaissance. It was not a sudden miracle, but a slow exhalation, a world remembering how to breathe again. The flame that had survived the long dark did not roar back to life all at once. It flickered in monasteries, in workshops, in the quiet hands of dreamers who refused to forget. What we call rebirth was, in truth, a remembering. The wisdom preserved by monks, the craftsmanship honed in humble villages, The stories carried through centuries of hardship all began to resurface like green shoots breaking through the soil of winter. The medieval world had not been idle. It had been germinating. Beneath its surface, seeds of art, science, and philosophy had been quietly waiting for light. When that light finally came, it was not new, it was ancient, rediscovered through endurance. The Renaissance, so often described as a victory of reason over darkness, was born from the very patience that the so-called Dark Ages had taught. The people who rebuilt Europe were the descendants of survivors, those who had learned how to endure famine, plague, and despair without surrendering the spark of curiosity. Their resilience became the foundation upon which wonder could stand. The artists and scholars who would later fill the world with color and thought owed their existence to the anonymous millions who had kept the fire alive through the longest night. It began quietly. In Florence and Venice, scholars opened ancient texts long buried in dust and candle smoke. The words of Plato, Aristotle, and Archimedes were read again not as heresy, but as revelation. These rediscoveries were not accidents. They were the harvest of centuries of preservation. The manuscripts copied by nameless monks, the Arabic translations carried across deserts, the whispered teachings passed through generations, all converged into a sudden blaze of thought. The world did not learn anew. It remembered how to wonder. In workshops, a different kind of miracle took place. Metalworkers who had once forged swords for survival now shaped instruments of precision. Artisans who built cathedrals began to experiment with perspective and proportion, turning divine geometry into visual language. Painters like Giotto and Masaccio found depth not only on walls but in perception itself. Their art was more than beauty. It was a declaration that humanity could see again not merely with the eyes, but with the soul. The same curiosity reached into the heavens. Astronomers began to chart the stars, not as omens, but as objects, measurable and divine in their order. The night sky, once a realm of fear, became a mirror of possibility. In the careful diagrams of early scientists, the medieval faith in mystery evolved into a new faith in understanding. The universe had not become less sacred, it had simply become larger. And yet, for all its brilliance, the Renaissance was not a rejection of the medieval spirit, it was its transformation. The sense of awe, the reverence for the unseen, the belief that meaning hid within form, all these survived. The difference was only in language. The monk's devotion to God became the scholar's devotion to truth. The mason's cathedral became the painter's canvas, the astronomer's sky, the philosopher's mind. The sacred had not disappeared, it had found new expression. It is tempting to imagine this rebirth as purely intellectual, a triumph of reason over superstition, but it was also emotional, spiritual, human. After so many centuries of suffering, people longed for beauty. They painted angels with human faces, saints with the softness of lovers. They filled churches with music that lifted the heart, not through fear, but through harmony. The divine was no longer distant. It was within reach, reflected in every brushstroke, every sculpture, every question dared to be asked. The Renaissance was not the light's conquest over darkness, it was the marriage of the two. From the struggle and silence of the medieval world came depth, humility, and endurance. From the rediscovery of the ancients came curiosity, courage, and vision. Together they formed something entirely new, a civilization that could look backward and forward at once, drawing strength from both memory and imagination. In this way, the rebirth of knowledge was also the rebirth of identity. Humanity began to see itself not merely as servant to divine will, but as participant in creation. The image of man, once bowed in humility, began to stand upright again, not in defiance, but in gratitude. The phrase, times homo faber, man the maker, captured this new awareness. Creation was no longer the privilege of gods. It was the destiny of those who remembered the divine spark within themselves. Still, the medieval shadow lingered, shaping the light that followed. For every leap in science or art, there remained a deep awareness of fragility. The memory of collapse had not faded. Behind the laughter of merchants in Florentine markets, behind the frescoes of paradise, was the whisper of how easily it could all vanish again. This awareness gave the Renaissance its poignancy. Beauty, they knew, was fleeting precisely because it had once been lost. From the ashes of the forgotten came the light we still live by. That light was not the sunburst of triumph, but the soft glow of remembrance. It carried within it the patience of monks, the resilience of peasants, the courage of healers and scholars who had preserved truth through persecution. The Renaissance did not rise against the Middle Ages, it rose because of them. The so-called darkness had taught humanity to endure. The new light taught it to create. The cycle had turned once more. The age of survival gave birth to the age of expression. The fires that once warmed huts now illuminated studios. The ink that once copied ancient prayers now drew blueprints for cathedrals and machines. And through it all, one thread remained unbroken: the human desire to understand, to build, to remember. Looking back, it becomes clear that the darkness was never absolute. It was gestation. The centuries of hardship were the womb from which modernity was born. Without them, the brilliance that followed would have had no depth, no humility, no soul. The Renaissance shone brightly because it carried the shadows of the world before it, those quiet centuries of endurance, when humanity learned that light is most sacred when it survives the night. As the 15th century dawned, Europe's cities filled with color, invention, and song. But beneath the beauty, the same ancient rhythm continued: creation, loss, renewal. The people of the Renaissance believed they had conquered the past, yet in their art and philosophy, the echoes of their ancestors still murmured. The cycle had not ended. It had simply entered a new verse. And so, as the world emerged from the long twilight of survival, it carried forward the greatest lesson of all: that the end of an age is not death, but transformation. The medieval soul had endured its trials, and from its endurance, the modern mind was born. And as the light of the Renaissance spread across the continents, it illuminated not only the world ahead, but the memory of the darkness behind, a reminder that every rebirth begins in shadow, and that from the forgotten, the flame of humanity forever rises anew. They survived because they remembered what we've forgotten. The people of the Middle Ages, so often dismissed as primitive, carried wisdom that we, in all our brilliance, have lost sight of. Their survival was not merely physical, it was spiritual, communal, and deeply aware of balance. They understood that to live was to adapt, to yield where the world demanded, and to endure where it mattered. They had no illusions of control. Their faith was not in dominance, but in belonging. In every hardship, they found rhythm. In every uncertainty, they found meaning. We imagine them as fragile, but in truth, they were resilient because they had learned to live within their limits. When winter came, they did not curse it. They prepared. When crops failed, they shared. Their lives were small, but their understanding vast. They knew that strength was not defiance of nature, but cooperation with it. The modern world, with all its machines and comforts, measures success by mastery. Theirs measured it by endurance, and perhaps by grace. They knew that simplicity was not poverty. In a world of scarcity, every object had value. A bowl was not disposable, it was a vessel for life. A cloak was repaired until it became a story in itself. Waste was unthinkable, because nothing was guaranteed. Their gratitude was not abstract, it was survival's quiet gratitude, the kind that humbles and deepens. When the fire burned low, they did not lament the darkness, they drew closer together. Warmth, for them, was shared, not bought. In that closeness lay their truest strength. A man alone could not endure a winter, a village could. They lived within a web of interdependence, so complete that to harm another was to harm oneself. Each person's labor fed the whole. The baker's hands depended on the farmers on the blacksmiths, and the blacksmiths on the woodcutters. This cycle of mutual reliance was not charity, it was design. It reminded them that survival was not a solitary act, but a collective promise renewed each morning. Faith, too, was woven into that promise. Not only faith in God, but faith in one another. The rituals that marked their days, lighting candles, breaking bread, saying prayers, were more than gestures of devotion. They were anchors of meaning. They gave structure to chaos, rhythm to uncertainty. When the harvest came, they celebrated not the abundance, but the miracle of continuance. Every loaf of bread, every healthy child, every sunrise was proof that existence itself was still holding them. Their faith was not blind, it was practical. It taught patience when the world offered none, forgiveness when bitterness would have been easier. They believed in cycles, the turning of seasons, the rising of the sun, the inevitable return of spring. Even in tragedy, they saw renewal waiting beneath the sorrow. They knew that the same earth that buried could also grow. From that understanding came humility. They did not see themselves as masters of creation, but participants in it. They accepted mystery as part of life's design. Where we seek explanation, they sought alignment. When illness came, they prayed and endured. When storms destroyed their fields, they rebuilt. They did not demand to know times why, times the world turned against them. They simply kept living until it turned again in their favor. This patience was not ignorance. It was wisdom, born of centuries of intimate dialogue with existence. There is a quiet nobility in that surrender, a kind of peace that the modern world, obsessed with control, can barely comprehend. Today we light the dark with electricity and still fear the shadows. They lit it with faith and felt no need to chase the night away. We seek answers in screens and algorithms. They found them in silence, in the slow understanding that not everything can or should be known. Their world was smaller, but their attention deeper. They did not glance at stars. They studied them. They did not rush through prayer. They lived within it. Their simplicity was not lack, but presence. To eat was to taste the season. To walk was to know the land. To rest was not guilt, but gratitude. They belonged to time rather than trying to conquer it. The tolling of a bell marked not interruption but rhythm, a reminder that each hour was part of something larger, something continuous. Even death, to them, was not an ending but a return, a folding back into the same soil that had fed them all their lives. We call their era dark because we mistake noise for light. But they, who had so little, understood what we do not. That meaning does not multiply with abundance. It is found in attention, in reverence, in connection. Their survival was not an accident. It was a philosophy lived daily. They did not separate work from prayer, nor body from spirit. Every act, planting, mending, feeding, was sacred because it sustained life. Imagine living in such a way that nothing felt wasted. Imagine trusting the world enough to move with it rather than against it. Their world was fragile, yes, but so are we. The difference is that they accepted fragility as truth, while we fight it as failure. They understood that vulnerability is the price of existence, and that to live fully is to accept that one day everything returns to the earth. They survived because they remembered what we've forgotten, that life does not owe us permanence, that comfort can dull wisdom, that endurance is born not from power, but from cooperation. They understood that belonging to land, to community, to meaning was richer than ownership. In their simplicity lay a quiet sophistication, an elegance of living shaped by necessity and faith. Their legacy is not the cathedrals they built or the kingdoms they lost. It is the knowledge that even in chaos, balance can be found, that beauty can coexist with hardship, that faith can flourish beside fear. They endured because they trusted the cycle that after cold comes thaw, after famine comes feast, after silence comes song. They knew that the world has its own memory, and that to live well is to listen to it. And perhaps that is the lesson waiting for us still. Beneath the hum of machines and the glow of screens, the old truths remain. The same stars that guided them guide us. The same earth that sustained them still beats beneath our feet. We are not so different, only our distractions have changed. The art of survival they mastered was not about invention, it was about remembrance. The people of the Dark Ages lived as if the sacred were everywhere, and in doing so, they made endurance divine. They survived because they remembered what we've forgotten. That meaning is not found in what we build, but in how we endure. And it is that endurance, the quiet persistence of the human spirit, that leads us toward the final reflection, not of how they lived, but of what their lives still whisper to us now, across the centuries, about who we are and what it truly means to survive. Maybe the future belongs to those who remember the past. We like to imagine progress as a clean break from history, a line drawn between then and now. Yet when we look closely, we find that every step forward rests on footprints already made. The modern world, its science, its art, its quiet luxuries, did not emerge from nothing. It was born from centuries of endurance, from the unrecorded lives of men and women who carried the flame through the coldest darkness. The medieval world, for all its struggle, was not primitive. It was wise. Its people understood what we, in our restless brilliance, have almost forgotten, that survival without soul is only half living. They lived slowly, but deeply. Their days were measured not in minutes, but in meaning. The ringing of a church bell, the shifting of the light, the call of birds, all were signals in the grand conversation between time and being. They didn't separate the sacred from the ordinary. They found holiness in every gesture. When they knelt to till the soil, they were both farmers and philosophers. When they built with stone, they were also praying. The world was their cathedral, and they moved within it with reverence. It is easy for us to see only their hardships, the cold, the hunger, the fear of disease. But within those hardships grew virtues that prosperity rarely teaches: patience, gratitude, endurance, and humility. These qualities are not glamorous, yet they are the scaffolding of every civilization that survives its own ambitions. The medieval people understood that strength was not dominance, but harmony, with the land, with each other, with the mystery that watched over them. They taught us the art of building from nothing. The walls of their villages were raised by hands that owned no wealth, only will. Their fields were cultivated by families who depended on one another more than on rulers or kings. In their labor was a quiet genius, the ability to sustain life with limited means, to repair rather than discard, to share rather than hoard. When famine came, they endured it together. When plague struck, they mourned together. When hope flickered, they rebuilt it together. Their unity was their greatest invention. Their wisdom was not written in books, but in the rhythm of life itself. They understood cycles, the planting and reaping, the rising and falling of seasons, the inevitability of loss and return. They did not resist the passage of time. They worked within it, trusting that the world, however cruel, still had purpose. Their faith was not naive, it was experiential. They had seen how winter always gave way to spring. They knew that the night sky, no matter how clouded, still hid the stars. We inherit more from them than we realize. The ideas that built our modern world, the dignity of labor, the value of community, the importance of continuity were born in those centuries we call dark. The craftsman's devotion to perfection, the healer's compassion, the scholar's hunger for knowledge. These were medieval virtues before they became modern ones. Even our language of progress, illumination, enlightenment, rebirth comes from their metaphors of faith and endurance. We still use their symbols, still walk their roads, still live in the architecture of their imagination. Their world moved more slowly, but perhaps that slowness was wisdom in disguise. They knew how to wait, how to let things unfold in their own time. When they built cathedrals, they knew they might never see them finished. Yet they worked anyway, stone by stone, day by day, trusting that the future would continue what the present could not complete. In that patience was a kind of immortality. They lived for continuity, not completion for the story, not the credit. And in their faith, there was courage, not the loud courage of conquest, but the quiet kind that faces uncertainty with grace. They lived close to death, yet did not let fear consume them. Their rituals, lighting candles, reciting prayers, marking the passage of days, were not superstition but structure, ways of giving shape to the unknowable. In the face of chaos, they created rhythm. In the face of despair, they made beauty. That is wisdom, to respond to darkness not with denial, but with creation. We call their world ancient, yet it was they who gave us the blueprint for endurance. They taught that knowledge without humility is blindness, that comfort without gratitude is decay. Their lives remind us that progress is not measured by speed or wealth, but by balance, how well we remember the cost of what we gain. They remind us that even in the smallest acts, mending, tending, waiting, there lies a form of greatness. Imagine if we carried that memory forward, if we built not only for efficiency but for meaning, not only for profit but for permanence. Imagine if our technologies served the same purpose their faith once did, to connect us, to humble us, to remind us of our place in something vast and mysterious. The medieval mind, for all its simplicity, held a sense of cosmic belonging. They knew they were part of a living order, earth, sky, spirit, and one another. Perhaps that is the wisdom we most need now, to rediscover belonging in a world that prizes separation. Maybe the future belongs to those who remember the past, not as nostalgia, but as compass, not as myth, but as mirror. For in remembering them, we remember ourselves, the part of us that endures hardship with dignity, that finds beauty in simplicity, that recognizes the sacred in ordinary life. Their age may be gone, but their lessons remain, that life is not about conquering the world, but learning how to live within it. If we listen, we can still hear them, the whisper of the forge, the toll of the bell, the quiet prayer before dawn. They speak through the ruins and the relics, through the architecture of our language and the rhythms of our rituals. They remind us that we are not the pinnacle of civilization, only its current stewards. Our towers, too, will crumble. Our machines will rust. But if we carry their wisdom of community, humility, and reverence, then perhaps something of us will last. They survived because they remembered what mattered. And if we remember them, truly remember, we may yet do the same. For the story of the medieval world is not one of darkness, but of continuity, the passage of flame from one trembling hand to the next. The light we hold now is the same light they once carried through centuries of night. And as it passes again toward futures we cannot see, it asks only this, that we honor those who kept it alive by tending it with care. And in that gentle tending, in that act of remembrance, we step into the final truth of their endurance, one that the last chapter will reveal, that survival, in its purest form, is not just about living through time, but carrying meaning across it. The night always returns, but so does the fire. In every age, in every corner of the world, darkness has come. Empires have fallen, cities have turned to dust, the great libraries have burned, and the voices of the wise have vanished into silence. Yet somehow, the flame has always survived. It travels quietly, from hand to hand, from heart to heart, never bright enough to blind, but never faint enough to die. The story of humanity is not one of endless progress, nor of unbroken light. It is a story of endurance, of remembering how to kindle warmth when the world grows cold. The people of the Middle Ages understood this better than we do. They lived with darkness, not as metaphor, but as fact. Yet within that darkness, they found meaning, rhythm, and beauty. They did not conquer the night, they befriended it. Their fires were small, but sacred. In every village, in every monastery, there was someone tending a flame, literal or spiritual, so that others might not lose their way. The blacksmith's forge, the monk's candle, the peasant's hearth, all were variations of the same act of defiance. The world could take their comfort, their wealth, their certainty, but not their light. That quiet refusal to surrender became the thread that connected them to us. For every invention we celebrate, every freedom we cherish, every word we speak with hope, exists because someone in the past chose to keep the fire burning when it would have been easier to let it fade. The night always returns, but so does the fire. When we imagine the medieval world, we often picture the hardship, the cold, the hunger, the fear of disease. But behind those images lies something more enduring, the human capacity to adapt, to find beauty in simplicity, to turn survival into art. The peasants who sang to the rhythm of their labor were composing the first hymns of resilience. The healers who gathered herbs under moonlight were practicing science disguised as superstition. The monks who copied ancient texts were the bridges across oblivion. They did not live to see their legacy, but we do. And perhaps the greatest tribute we can offer them is to recognize ourselves in their endurance. For the truth is, we are not so different. Our cities are brighter, our tools sharper, our voices louder, but the same fears and hopes still flicker within us. We, too, face nights that feel endless. We, too, search for meaning in a world that often feels indifferent. And just like them, we carry a flame, the instinct to protect, to remember, to begin again. The medieval people did not survive because they were stronger. They survived because they understood that survival is a shared act, a chain of memory, linking the living to the dead, the past to the present to the future. Listen closely, and you can still hear their world in ours. The ring of a hammer in a workshop echoes the blacksmith's anvil. The hum of machines mimics the rhythm of mill wheels on rivers long dried. The stories we tell about loss, love, and hope are new in language, but ancient in soul. The flame they guarded has simply changed form. It burns now in ideas, in compassion, in creativity. Every gesture of kindness, every pursuit of knowledge, every act of creation is another spark from that same timeless fire. Perhaps this is what the medieval mind grasped that we have lost, that endurance is not the absence of despair, but the ability to walk through it with light in your hands. They did not wait for the world to become easy, they learned how to live despite it. They accepted the fragility of life as part of its beauty. To them, the fleeting moment, the flicker of candlelight, the brief song before sleep was not lesser than eternity. It times was time's eternity, condensed into a heartbeat. The fire was more than warmth, it was memory. Each flame lit from another was an act of continuity, a defiance against forgetting. In monasteries, candles were never allowed to die completely. Their light symbolized the soul's persistence, the mind's refusal to be extinguished. When one went out, another was lit from its last ember. That same gesture repeats endlessly through time, even now. When you comfort someone in despair, when you teach, when you love, when you hope you are lighting from their ember, the chain is unbroken. The night always returns, but so does the fire. The world has always moved between light and shadow. The Roman world gave way to the medieval to the modern to whatever will come next. Each believed it was the end, yet each became the beginning. Collapse is not extinction, it is transformation. What survives is not always what we expect. Not the empires, nor the monuments, but the small, persistent things, stories, songs, faith, and fire. We live surrounded by light, and yet so often feel the dark pressing in, perhaps because light without meaning is only glare. The people of the past did not have our abundance, but they had purpose. Their light was earned. Their days were fragile enough that each one felt sacred. They prayed not for immortality, but for endurance. And they found it not in power, but in the quiet repetition of care. The tending of fields, the mending of walls, the kindness between neighbors. These, too, are acts of civilization, as important as invention or conquest. The medieval world has much to teach the modern one. It teaches that patience is strength, that faith, whether in God, in one another, or in the cycle of nature, is not naive, but necessary. It teaches that darkness is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a landscape to be understood. That silence is not emptiness, but space for reflection. It reminds us that we come from people who endured what seemed unendurable, and that we are their continuation. The same blood, the same breath, the same fire. When we stand beneath the stars, we stand in the same light they once saw. The same constellations guided their prayers and their planting. The same moon illuminated their long walks home. Time separates us, but wonder unites us. The sky they gazed upon in fear and awe is the same one that watches us now, older, perhaps wiser, but no less infinite. And beneath that sky, the same question burns. How do we keep the light alive? Maybe the answer is simpler than we think. We keep it by remembering. By noticing the small moments that tether us to meaning, the warmth of a shared meal, the quiet of early morning, the sound of laughter echoing down a hallway. We keep it by caring for the fragile things that outlast us. Words, art, love, kindness. We keep it by refusing to let despair define us. Just as those before us tended their fires through famine and frost, so too can we protect the light of compassion through the storms of our own age. The night always returns, but so does the fire. The world may change, but the rhythm remains. There will always be nights of fear, of forgetting, of silence, but there will also always be someone, somewhere, striking flint against stone, someone telling a story, someone singing softly in the dark. These are the acts that rebuild worlds. Civilization does not begin with conquest. It begins with care, with the lighting of a single flame against the vast unknown. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing in one of those medieval halls. The walls are rough stone, the air cold enough that your breath becomes visible. A single candle flickers before you, its light trembling, alive. Around you, silence. Beyond the walls, the endless dark of the world. But that light, it is enough. It dances against the stone and chases shadows into corners. It asks nothing grand, only that you tend it, that you protect it until morning. That simple act was, and still is, the essence of humanity. Because survival is not about strength, it is about remembrance. The strong build empires, but the remembering keep them alive. Every great rebirth in history, every renaissance, every revolution began not with power, but with memory. Someone remembered what mattered. Someone chose to pass it on. The flame we carry now, in our knowledge and our compassion, in our art and our courage, is the sum of every life that refused to let it die. And so, the question becomes not whether the light will last, but whether we will remember how to tend it, whether we will honor what they taught, the patience to rebuild, the humility to belong, the courage to care. The medieval soul, for all its superstition and fear, possessed a wisdom our modern minds still chase, the knowledge that the most fragile things are often the most eternal. A flame can be snuffed in a breath, yet it can also ignite 1,000 others. The night always returns, but so does the fire. Even now, the same story unfolds. Somewhere, a scientist works through exhaustion to cure disease. Somewhere, an artist paints through despair. Somewhere, a parent stays awake beside a sleeping child, guarding a small universe of hope. Somewhere, a lonely soul writes words that might reach another, centuries later, and remind them they are not alone. These are our candles in the dark, small, trembling, alive. The medieval world may seem far away, yet its lessons live within us. Every time we rebuild after loss, every time we choose kindness over fear, every time we remember that meaning outlasts hardship, we become part of the same lineage of endurance. We are the inheritors of their courage, the stewards of their light. The world turns, the centuries change, but the human heart remains the same, fragile, defiant, luminous. And perhaps that is the truest miracle, that the flame, once kindled in those ancient nights, still burns in us now. Through every collapse and rebirth, through every silence and storm, it has traveled across generations, carried by those who refuse to give in to the dark. When the last words fade and the final image dissolves, the lesson remains. The night always returns, but so does the fire. It lives in the warmth we give, the stories we tell, the compassion we share. It is not the light of conquest, but of care, not the brilliance of victory, but the glow of endurance. So when the world feels vast and uncertain, when the night seems endless, remember this: you are not alone in the dark. You are part of an unbroken chain that stretches across centuries, each life a link of light. Somewhere, Someone once tended a flame for you, just as you now tend it for those yet to come. And as long as one hand, one heart, one breath continues the act of remembering, then the flame will never die. The night always returns, but so does the fire.